4 Weddings and a Baby. Heartwarming friendship fiction. Five Island Cove, Book 6. Written by Jesse Newton. Narrated by Jill Smith. Chapter 1. Eloise Hall woke when her fiancé's alarm went off. Thankfully, the first light of day had started to seep through the curtains, and Eloise knew she wouldn't go back to sleep. She'd had a terrible time falling asleep, too, because today marked only 3 days until her wedding, and her dress was completely tailored and ready to be picked up. Robin would be by at 9:30 to take Eloise to the dress shop, and then they needed to finalize the fruit platter with the caterer as well. She'd selected a seasonal fruit buffet, and the caterer now knew what they could offer. "Getting up, sweetheart?" Aaron asked from his side of the bed. "Yes," she said. "I promised Billy I'd help her with her hair today, and I've got a call with Marge before Robin's coming." "I can't wait to see the dress," he said, coming around to her side of the bed. He leaned over and kissed her. "You can see it in 3 days," Eloise said, feeling soft and warm inside this house, this bed, the arms of this man. "Not a day sooner, I'm sure," Aaron said, smiling. "Not a day sooner," Eloise said. "Can you imagine the scandal that would hit the Cove Chronicles if it got out that the chief of police had seen his bride's dress before the wedding day?" "If that's the huge scandal that gets attached to my name, I'll take it," he said, sighing as he sat on the bed near her knees. "Are they going to print the article about your dad?" "He says this kind of stuff happens every election year." "I don't understand what would possess someone to want to run for office." "It takes a special breed of human being," Aaron agreed, his hand moving down Eloise's leg. "You and the girls will be back in time for dinner with my parents?" "Of course," Eloise said, enjoying Aaron's touch against her skin. "We'll be on the 5:20 ferry, and we'll be here by 6. "Great," he said. "The food will be delivered at 6:30, and we'll eat soon after that." "I'll make sure the girls are at nearly their best before we leave the inn," Eloise said. "They're my parents," Aaron said. "They know what Billy and Grace are like. Right after their mother left, my mom came over. We were all a horrible mess, and I don't think I'd brushed poor Grace's hair for a week." Eloise lay in bed and listened to him talk for a few more minutes, and then he stood. "I'm going to go shower, love." "Okay." Eloise rolled over and closed her eyes, letting the soothing sound of the rainfall showerhead lull her back to sleep. When Aaron came back into the bedroom to put on his shoes, she woke again. "I love you, El," he said on his way out the door, and Eloise repeated the sentiment back to him. A few minutes later, she got out of bed and padded down the hall in her nightgown, where she found Aaron making coffee and Billy shoving books in her backpack. The silence in the kitchen meant they'd started this Thursday with an argument, and the way Billy looked at Eloise with such earnestness confirmed it. "Make sure you have your math homework," Aaron said, turning and sipping from his mug. "I've got it, Dad," Billy snapped. Eloise wasn't sure what they'd argued about, and she swept into the kitchen to get a cup of coffee, her eyes on Aaron. "What's going on?" "Billy wants to bring a date to our wedding," he said. Eloise had not yet picked up a cup, a fact she was very glad of, for she'd probably have dropped it. Her eyes flew back to Billy, who cocked her hip and put one hand on it. She'd matured a lot this year, and Eloise loved her fiercely. The protective streak she possessed for Billy didn't make sense to her, and she knew it was only stronger for Aaron. "It's not a date, Dad." "When you bring a boy to a wedding, it's a date," Aaron said. "He's my friend." "Who is it?" Eloise asked, placing both palms against the countertop. She stood next to Aaron, and she hoped they were a united front. She'd taken Billy's side several times in the past, and she didn't want to undermine Aaron with his daughter. "It's Chris Knight." "Chris Knight?" Eloise and Aaron asked together. "Oh, no," Aaron added, shaking his head. "I know those Knight boys. They're always in trouble, and I've heard enough of their name to last a lifetime." "First," Billy said, "they're his half-brothers, and much older than him, Dad. He gets his own chance, doesn't he?" "He should." "That's what you're always saying," Billy said. "Don't judge, Bills. Everyone gets their own chance." "Billy," Aaron said, his voice soft but powerful. Eloise glanced at him, hating that he and his daughter argued so much. They didn't really. Usually only when it came to Billy and the fact that she was growing up. "He's just my friend," Billy said. "I thought we liked a boy named Alex," Eloise said. "I do," Billy said. "That's why it's not a date if Chris comes with me to the wedding. You said there'd be dancing and we're in the same dance class. I told my teacher about the dancing at the wedding, and she said anyone who dances outside of class gets extra credit." She shoved another notebook in her bag and zipped it closed. "He asked if he could come because he's not a great dancer and he needs the extra credit." "So you didn't invite him?" Eloise said. "No." Billy stepped into the kitchen. "Will you braid my hair now?" "Yes, dear, get the stuff." Billy went to get the comb and hair ties, and Eloise got out her coffee mug. She said nothing, because Aaron needed to make this decision himself. "I suppose the boy can come to the wedding." "He'll probably step on her feet and cause a scene," Eloise said dryly. "They'll trip into the cake or something." Such a thing would be a disaster, what with all the press that would be at the wedding. Eloise reminded herself that Aaron was only 5 Island Cove royalty, and that literally no one outside of these 5 tiny islands in the middle of the sea would know about their wedding, whether someone tripped into a cake or not. She braided Billy's hair and kissed Aaron goodbye, hurried Grace through eating and getting her shoes on, and sent the girls out the door to school. She retrieved her phone from the bedroom, where she kept it plugged in overnight, and checked it on her way to the shower. She had 3 missed calls from Robin. Shock and fear struck her as one giant lightning bolt. No matter what, 3 calls from Robin before 8 o'clock in the morning was not good. Eloise's fingers fumbled as she dialed her friend and wedding planner. "Eloise, I don't want you to freak out," Robin said when she answered the phone. "I'm already freaking out," Eloise said. "You called 3 times. "There's been an accident at the dress shop," Robin said, and she sounded breathless, as if she'd run from her house to Beachfront Avenue, where the dress shop sat. "What kind of accident?" "Emma called," Robin said. "I haven't seen the dress yet, but Elle..." She blew out her breath. "I'm on the way right now, and I'll let you know. I just want you to be prepared." "What happened?" Eloise asked again. "Just tell me, Robin, then I can be prepared for what I might find." The dress had taken the longest for her to find and tailor. She had a love-hate relationship with it as it was, but in the end, she truly did love the dress, and she felt strong and sexy in it at the same time. She knew Aaron would love it, and Eloise felt the first hot tears enter her eyes as she waited for Robin to explain further. "There was a burst pipe," Robin said, sighing again. "Overnight, it apparently gushed for hours, and some of their dresses got wet." "No," Eloise gasped. "I don't even know if one of them was yours," Robin said. "And things dry out, Elle." "I'll change and meet you there," Eloise said. She could reschedule her call, as she understood the nature of emergencies better than most. "Okay," Robin agreed readily. "I'm leaving now." Eloise clutched her purse, as if the tightness in her knuckles would keep all of her emotions in check. Before she'd returned to the Cove only a short 9 months ago, Eloise had lived a fairly mundane life. She taught college students about biology, and she'd enjoyed it. Her life had been predictable, and she'd never gotten calls like the kind she'd had with Robin a half hour ago. She hadn't dared to call Aaron because she couldn't stand the thought of postponing the wedding. They'd been waiting long enough as it was. Absolutely everything was in place, and Eloise just wanted to walk down the aisle and pledge herself to Aaron. She'd packed everything in her tiny house on Sanctuary. All she needed to do was move it, something she and Aaron were planning to do after their honeymoon. He'd taken time off work, a feat not easily achieved for the chief of police. "Looks like the street is closed, ma'am," the rideshare driver said. Eloise pulled her attention from the side window where she'd been looking and toward his voice. He peered through the windshield. "I think this is as far as I can get you." "Here is great," Eloise said, her voice steady and strong. She was not going to break down over this. It was a dress, not her health. Aaron hadn't abandoned her at the altar. Everything else would still be flawless. "Thank you." She swiped her payment card and got out of the car. In front of her, the street had been closed, and a pair of police officers worked the scene, along with 5 or 6 people dressed in dark blue polo shirts with the Five Island Cove utility logo on them. "Ma'am," someone said as she took her first step down the sidewalk, "you can't come this way. It's closed." "My dress," she said, glancing around for Robin. If she couldn't get down the street, maybe Robin couldn't either. "I got a call from Judy's bridal about my dress." "They're down on the other end of the street," he said. "Okay," Eloise said. "I can go around?" She could walk a block over and then down. "Eloise?" She turned toward the sound of a familiar voice. "Paul," she said. "The dress shop called about my dress." He wore a sympathetic look as he approached. "I'll take you." He nodded to the utility worker. "She's okay. I'll get her down there." He reached for her, and Eloise let him put his arm around her. "How bad is it?" she asked as they navigated past the yellow caution tape. The left side of the street had been dug into, and Eloise wished the smell didn't remind her of the sewer. An image of her dirty and stained dress flashed through her mind, but she quickly pushed it away. "They've called the mainland for new pipes," Paul said. "This street is going to be shut down for at least 2 days. Eloise didn't own any of the shops here, but going into a weekend with good weather, she wouldn't be happy to be shut down. "Watch your step here," Paul said, taking her onto a board that went over the hollowed-out street. She followed him carefully, watching where she put her feet until she stepped back onto cement. Paul delivered her to the end of the street and past another barrier keeping people out. Eloise spotted the white tent where a few women had crowded, and in the next moment, she saw Robin. "Thank you, Paul," she said, pausing to look up at him. She put her hand on his arm. "Please, don't tell Aaron anything. I'll talk to him as soon as I know what's going on." Paul looked from the tent where dresses hung on portable racks to her. "Good luck, Eloise." He bent down and hugged her, and Eloise clung to him a little bit. She cleared her throat as she stepped away, and Robin took the last 2 steps to her. She grabbed her in a hug and said, "Come see. It's not so bad." "Really?" Eloise asked as she started walking with Robin. They arrived at the tent, where Eloise picked out her dress instantly. Not so bad? She took in the once white lace that now held a shade of gray no one wanted on their wedding dress. There was no way that would come clean. The strongest bleach couldn't take out sludge. The bottom of the dress looked like someone had dipped it into a vat of dye the color of mud, and it seeped up the skirt until it finally petered out. Only the middle of the dress, From about the knees to the wide sash around her waist and into a few inches of the lace that covered the bodice, remained clean. She reached out and touched the wide straps that went over her shoulders. They too had the look like someone had dropped gray ashes on them and then rubbed them into the fabric. This is terrible. There's no way I can get this cleaned. Yes, Robin said, hooking her arm through Eloise's. We can. I've already called Mike, and he's waiting for us. She tightened her hold on Eloise's arm. It's just mud. He can clean it. This isn't mud, Eloise said, drawing back her fingers from the sooty substance. What is that? It's debris from the ceiling, Robin said in a miserable voice. Mike is a miracle worker, Elle. Let's get this over to him. She released Eloise's arm and picked up the dress. I've got my van. She seemed so positive and so sure, and Eloise grabbed onto her optimism as she went with Robin. That was all she could do. Oh, and pray. She could do that too, and Eloise kept up a stream of pleading as Robin put the ruined wedding dress in the back of her van. Do we have a backup plan? Eloise asked as she got in the passenger seat. Robin looked at Eloise, pure nerves in her expression. Let's go shopping as soon as the stores open, she said, just in case. Chapter 2. Alice Kelton bent to take the pizza out of the oven just as the front door opened. It would be Laurel, the female cop that had joined their friend group last summer. Alice had really taken a liking to her, and she found herself fiercely protective of the other woman. She thought her former abusive relationship had something to do with that, as Alice had come to view her marriage with Frank as abusive too. In some ways, Alice was so much better off without Frank. She'd regained her confidence and control over her life, and she liked that. In other ways, though, she had quiet moments of loneliness, despite being surrounded by people she loved and who loved her. It's just me, Laurel called, the door closing a moment after she finished speaking. Smells good in here. The dark-haired woman appeared from the hallway, dressed in her police officer uniform and wearing a smile. It's just boxed pizza, Alice said, returning her smile. It's better than a protein shake. Laurel sat at the bar, a long sigh coming from her mouth. Alice watched her, her mind moving through several scenarios. I know that look, Laurel said, reaching for a can of soda. Just spit it out, Alice. When are you going to set a date? She said. The pop hiss sound of Laurel's can opening filled the air, and then her eyes widened. You didn't check your phone. She looked around as if Alice's phone would be right there, blinking that she had a message. Alice had left it in the bedroom, because she'd used it as an alarm for when Arthur had to leave. Her face filled with heat, though she tried to keep it cool. Not for a while, she admitted. Did you set a date? September 8th, Laurel said, her face falling slightly. It's later than I'd like, but we'll basically be taking the whole force for the wedding. And if we wait until after Labor Day, things will be quiet here in the Cove. And Aaron said we could each have 2 weeks off. Wow, Alice said. 2 weeks. Yeah, Laurel said. It's almost 5 months, but it's okay. Alice nodded in agreement. Are you going to move in with him before the wedding? She turned to get out the pizza cutter. If she could keep Laurel talking about Paul and their upcoming nuptials, then Alice wouldn't have to talk about Arthur. She couldn't believe she'd kept their relationship as much of a secret as she had. Robin asked the most questions, of course. Every time she'd asked over the past 2 weeks, Alice had been able to put her off with a simple, yes, I'm still seeing him. It had only been 3 weeks, though she supposed she hadn't dated Will for much longer than that. No, Laurel said. My mother would be mortified. She grinned as she tipped her head back to drink from her soda can. What about you? She set the can on the counter. Things going well with Arthur? Alice kept her gaze on the pizza as she cut across it. Yeah, she said, not able to hide her smile. With Laurel, she didn't have to hide as much. The woman could be very discreet, and Alice liked that. She herself wasn't great with secrets, and she thought maybe she could just tell Laurel about Arthur. No, she thought, keep it to yourself a little longer. Things are going well, she said. I mean, it's been 3 weeks, but yeah, good. She shrugged and finished cutting the pizza. She got out a couple of paper plates and handed one to Laurel. What about Charlie? Laurel asked. That boy, Alice said, shaking her head and seizing the safe topic. He's going to be the death of me. Why's that? Laurel rose up onto her feet to get a couple pieces of pizza, and Alice sat down next to her at the bar. He's already kissing Soraya. I caught them last night on my own front porch. He is a cute boy. Yeah, who broke up with a different girl only 2 weeks ago, if that. Alice wasn't sure how many days it had been. Maybe only 10 or so. No matter what, it felt fast to her. She hadn't breathed a word of it to Robin, as it was her daughter Charlie had broken up with after almost a year of dating. He'll figure things out, Laurel said. I hope so, Alice said. I talked to him until I'm blue in the face. I'm not sure it's getting through. I think it does more than you think. Laurel offered her a supportive smile, and Alice did appreciate that. September 8th, Alice said, lifting her pizza to her mouth. What are you thinking? Beach? Indoors? What kind of dress? Laurel started to talk, and Alice simply listened to her detail her first planning session with Robin and how they'd already started looking for dresses online. I'm not very feminine, Laurel said, so I don't know about the dress. I honestly just want to wear a skirt with my police uniform. Then do that, Alice said. Will Paul wear his dress uniform? I think so, she said. I just mentioned it to him last night, but we got interrupted before we could talk too much about it. Alice nodded as if she understood interruptions. In a lot of ways, she did. She could have her whole day planned, only to have everything implode by 10 a.m. Nothing on her to-do list would get done, and the hours slipped through her fingers like smoke. So, Laurel said, and the hair on Alice's arm stood up. Tell me about Robin and her mother. Alice looked at Laurel, searching her face. Why? What happened? Her protective streak kicked in because Jennifer Golden had a special way of making Robin feel 2 feet tall and completely insignificant. Robin had been fighting with her for decades, and Alice knew how hard she'd been trying to build a bridge between them. Her mom didn't make it easy, that was for sure. Her mom arrived during our session a few nights ago, and they got in a little fight. Alice waited for Laurel to say more, but she remained silent. What did Robin say? Nothing, Laurel said. I waved to her and slipped out while they were arguing. I haven't spoken to her since. I mean, a text here or there about the wedding. If Robin hadn't said anything, Alice didn't want to betray her confidence. They've never gotten along, Alice said, trying to find the surface details that would explain but not betray her friend. They fought like crazy when we were teens, and Robin's been trying to prove she's good enough for her mother for her entire life. She's literally one of the best people I know, Laurel said, her eyes wide. I know, Alice said. You won't find someone who cares more. She knows everyone on the island, and she knows all the best deals. She's so organized. She's pretty, she's thin, she's been married to the same man for almost 20 years. Alice shook her head. Nothing is ever good enough for her mom. I know Robin tries, but I think she just gets tired. Laurel nodded and dusted her hands together, her pizza gone. I was just wondering. She's never said much about her family, her parents and siblings. Alice wasn't surprised by that at all. She drew in a deep breath. I can't wait for Eloise's wedding. I think they're finalizing the fruit platter today, and then everything is set. Laurel's eyes widened again. Didn't you hear? Eloise might postpone. You really need to look at your phone. Alice sucked in a breath, her heart positively stopping. What? Postpone? Why? She got to her feet and started toward her bedroom, her heartbeat flying through her veins. Her dress got ruined, Laurel called after her, and Alice cried out, "You're kidding!" She swiped her phone from the nightstand and saw all the missed messages in the group text. 84 messages, my word. She tapped and started reading, unable to get a proper breath. Laurel had announced her wedding day. The others had congratulated her and said they'd mark their calendars. Robin had gotten on and said they'd had a slight problem at the dress shop, but that she and Eloise had taken the dress to a cleaner. AJ and Kristen had asked the most questions, and Robin fielded them all, not Eloise. The truth was, they didn't know if the dress would come clean. They were shopping for alternatives that day, and Alice didn't have to imagine the anxiety Eloise must be feeling. It ran through her right now. Eloise had then said, "I might push things back. I need a dress to get married in." Everyone had gotten on and expressed support and concern for her. Everyone except Alice, of course. The string had gone quiet after that, and Alice cursed herself for putting her phone on silent while she made love with Arthur. The truth was, though, the phone distracted her when it went off during the brief time Arthur had in the middle of the day. She'd learned to put it on silent so they could enjoy one another, and she'd never missed much. Until today. She typed out a quick message of congrats for Laurel, though the woman sat in the kitchen, and then one of sympathy for Eloise, asking, "What can I do to help? I knew a woman in the Hamptons who could get the most gorgeous dresses. Maybe she could help?" She stepped back into the kitchen, noting that Arthur had also texted since he'd left her house. "You got it?" Laurel asked. She drained the last of her soda and met Alice's eyes. "Yes," she said. "She can't postpone. The press will go crazy. Not to mention the chief has everything set so he can be gone." Laurel wore a look of sympathy. "I don't think she'll actually postpone. She probably just feels like she needs to." Her phone chimed and she looked at it. "Oh, it's you." Alice nodded as she sat back down. Arthur's message shining in her face. "I miss you already. Dinner tonight? My place after that?" Alice only had 2 words for that. Yes and yes. And she sent them while Laurel said something about Kelli's wellness center. "Okay," she said a moment later. "I better get going. I can see you've got someone better to talk to." Alice lifted her head, surprised and embarrassed at what Laurel had said. "No," she said. "You don't have to go." "Yeah, I can tell it's Arthur," Laurel said, grinning. She clearly wasn't upset. "You're glowing." Alice's face heated again. "I am not." "You are," Laurel said, laughing. She stood and leaned over Alice's shoulder, clearly looking at her phone. "Oh, and making plans for tonight, I see." A message popped up, and Alice gasped as she read it. Laurel did too. She practically threw her phone across the kitchen, really only managing to toss it a foot or so, where it slid toward the opposite edge of the counter. "My goodness," Laurel said, sitting right back down. The bar stool moved as she did, creating a terrible noise against the floor. "Alice?" Her name was full of questions, but Alice didn't know how to answer any of them. Arthur's message burned her retinas, and she'd never get rid of the words. "I know it's fast, but I'm thinking about marriage. Can we talk about that tonight?" Seconds ticked by, each painfully loud in Alice's ears. "What are you going to say?" Laurel asked, her voice finally breaking the silence. Her phone chimed, and Alice's eyes flew to it. Slowly, as if encased in quicksand, Laurel reached for it. Alice wanted to shout at her not to read the texts, especially not the ones Arthur had sent before he'd come over that morning. She deleted his texts several times each day because her children picked up her phone at will, and she didn't need them to see anything that would indicate her physical relationship with their school counselor. "Oh, my," Laurel said, breathing out heavily. She put the phone in front of Alice, who couldn't help looking at the text. We can eat that seafood scampi from the bridge and just talk about it. Then I'll do that thing you like at the edge of the bed. Alice pressed her eyes closed, her whole body hot. She definitely liked the things Arthur did in the bedroom. He was an excellent lover, and Alice wasn't embarrassed of a consensual adult relationship with him. She enjoyed talking to him, and she enjoyed kissing him. How long have you been sleeping with him? Laurel asked. I don't think that's the most important question, Alice said, her voice hoarse. No? Laurel asked. What is then? She looked at Laurel, pure shock moving through her. Who wants to talk about marriage after 3 weeks of dating? Her phone chimed again, and she and Laurel both bent over it. You've gone silent, which means you don't want to talk about marriage. It's just a conversation, Alice. Nothing too serious. Nothing too serious, she repeated. Isn't marriage serious? Just tell him that, Laurel said. Maybe you do want to talk about marriage, though. Alice swallowed because she wasn't sure. I haven't even been divorced for a year, she said. Well, you could be the 4th wedding this summer, Laurel said with a smile. Might have to fight Kelli for the spot, though. She and Shad seem to be getting pretty serious, too. Is there a limit on the number of weddings we can have this summer? Alice teased, flipping her phone over so whatever Arthur said next would stay secret for a few extra seconds. And you can't even breathe a word of this to anyone else. I wouldn't dare, Laurel said, smiling. And I think the limit is 4. 4 weddings, Alice. So if you want that spot... She let her words hang there, though she was clearly teasing. She got to her feet and gave Alice a side hug. I have to jet. Duty calls. She started for the front door, calling over her shoulder. And answer that man. He's dying. Alice picked up her phone the moment Laurel closed the front door behind her and reread all of Arthur's messages. Her fingers hovered over the screen while her mind whirred and whirred. Finally, she typed, We can talk about marriage if there's plenty of shrimp scampi and that carrot cake from Shirley's. She grinned at her message, her smile widening at Arthur's response that came in a few seconds later. Carrot cake ordered. Alice pressed her phone to her heart, letting the fantasy of her own summer beach wedding run through her mind. Could she really marry Arthur Rice so soon? Don't be ridiculous, part of her mind told her, while the other half thought, why not? Mom? Charlie called, and Alice hastened to delete the messages from Arthur as her son's footsteps came closer. There you are, he said, stepping past her and taking a piece of pizza. Is it okay if I go over to Soraya's after work? You never answered me. He wore eagerness and hope on his face, and Alice didn't have the heart to tell him no. You be safe with that girl, she said. I am, Mom, he said, grinning at her. He grabbed onto her and hugged her. I won't be late since it's a school night. I'm going out with Arthur tonight, she said. I won't be late either. 10 for both of us. Okay, Charlie said, hurrying back the way he'd come. Love you, Mom. Love you too, she called. And her fantasy warped and disappeared when she thought about how she could possibly tell her twins that she might marry their counselor. Chapter 3. Robin Grover was not the type of woman to give up without a fight. She checked her phone, though she had the ringer set on high, and it had not made a sound in over 30 minutes. A couple of cushy armchairs sat in front of the wide wall of dressing rooms at Castle Bridal, but Robin couldn't commit to sitting down. Energy ran through her body as if someone had connected her to a live wire, and she simply needed to stay on her feet. Eloise had gone into one of the dressing rooms with an attendant with a waist no bigger than a toothpick, and Robin worried as much about that as she did about making sure Eloise had the perfect dress to wear as she walked down the aisle. They'd already spent hours finding that dress, trying on that dress, and altering that dress. It felt like such a huge setback to be doing it all over again. She checked her phone, her pulse pounding when she still didn't have a text from Mike or Georgia, the only other dressmaker in the Cove that Robin trusted to make wedding dresses. Sometimes Georgia had rentals that worked well for last-minute nuptials, and Robin had already spoken to her twice that morning. Her phone dinged, and Robin nearly dropped it. She lifted it so quickly. Alice had finally texted, "What can I do to help? I knew a woman in the Hamptons who could get the most gorgeous dresses. Maybe she could help?" Robin tapped to call her because she would take any help she could get. It was an hour flight to the Hamptons, and she'd make it herself to get Eloise the right dress. Before she could get the call off, the dressing room door opened, and Eloise stepped out. Robin shoved her phone in her back pocket and stepped around the plush chairs, trying to see everything at once. Such a feat was impossible, but Robin sure did try harder than anyone. The sleeves made her frown, but Robin straightened it as quickly as she could. Sleeves could be replaced. She could cut them off herself and sew under the raw edge. She would, too, if it meant Eloise had the perfect dress for her big day. The dress didn't gape around her bust, which made Robin smile. The shiny, white fabric spoke a little bit of the 80s, and 5 months ago, Robin would have vetoed this dress on that fabric alone. It would cause a glare in the photos. But at this point, she couldn't be too terribly picky. The bodice clung to Eloise's midsection, and the wide sash went around the waist. So far, so good. The skirt flared from there, dropping to the ground in layers and layers of fabric, lace on the lower half of the dress that made it look unique and expensive. It probably would cost a pretty penny, but Eloise hadn't mentioned a budget for this impromptu and emergency shopping situation. "What do you think?" Robin asked. "I hate the sleeves," Eloise said. "I can fix the sleeves." "We can take them off, too," the toothpick-sized attendant said. Robin glanced at her and took in her name, Sabrina. "How quickly?" Robin asked. "They're made to come on and off," Sabrina said, stepping over to Eloise and tugging on the sleeves. "We've rented this dress out before, and I know the last girl had us put them on." She twisted the fabric under as Robin caught Elle's frown of displeasure. "You can rent this dress?" Robin asked, meeting Eloise's eye. Sudden understanding filled her friend's eyes, and she turned back to the mirrors that spanned the whole wall. "I do like the lace on the bottom," she said. "It makes it look very fancy." "It's different," Robin agreed, because she knew Eloise wanted a unique dress. She didn't want something everyone and their sister had worn. "Yes, you can rent this," Sabrina said. "It's $300 for the day." "That's all?" Robin asked, surprised. Why was she having her brides buy wedding dresses from Judy's when they could rent from here? "We have rentals from $199 to $999, Sabrina said. "I've got a fabulous Jennifer Pennis for $600. "The Pennises don't look good on me," Eloise said. "She puts way too much frilly fabric around the waist. That's already the thickest part of me." She smoothed her hands down the front of her body, and Robin thought the thick fabric did a nice job of covering up the parts of Eloise's body she didn't like. "The train is pretty long," Robin said, bending to pick it up. "Did you see that, Elle?" "I did," she said. "It's not a deal breaker, right?" "No," Robin said. "I just want to make sure we're not taking the first one just because we can." "Did you see Alice's text?" Eloise asked, meeting Robin's eyes in the mirror. "I was going to call her." "I don't know if we need to," Eloise said. "I could wear this if the sleeves were removed and a nice wide strap held the dress up." "We have 2 more to try on, too," Sabrina said, her eyes wide and eager to help. "But definitely, the straps aren't a problem. When is the wedding?" "Sunday," Eloise said. "This Sunday?" Sabrina said, actually pressing one palm to her heart. "Yes," Robin said. "I'm surprised you don't have more women in here. Judy's had a burst pipe and several dresses got dirty." "Ruined," Eloise said, almost over the top of her. "No," Robin said. "We're getting the dress cleaned, but we wanted a backup plan." Sabrina's mouth dropped open, and she said, "You're kidding." "Not kidding," Robin said. "If you can't alter the sleeves by Saturday, I'll take it and do it myself." "Let's try the other two dresses," Eloise said. "Maybe I'll like one of them more and it won't be a problem." She swished into the dressing room, holding up the skirt in double fistfuls of fabric. Robin watched her go, admiring her resilience and optimism. Eloise had always been steady and strong in the face of disaster, and Robin finally sank into the armchair and let it swallow her whole, letting her mind drift back to the day she and Eloise had gone to the high school to take the ACT. Robin had just gotten her driver's license, and she'd picked up Eloise at the ferry station and driven them to the test. Eloise had finished way before Robin, and by the time Robin had come out, she'd been in a huge hurry to leave. Her mother's unreasonableness stretched back decades, and she wanted Robin to have the car back by 1 o'clock. In her hurry to get out of the parking lot and get home before her mother's deadline, she'd cut the corner too close as she'd backed out. The entire passenger side of the car had scraped along the bumper of a truck, and Robin had slammed on the brakes and then frozen. Eloise had not. She'd known exactly what to do, and she got out of the car and wrote down the license plate number of the truck. They'd had to wait until the owner of it came outside, and Robin had been mortified to face Jeremy Simpson. Of course she'd had to hit the most popular boy's truck. Of course. And she'd been late, and her mother hadn't let her drive the car again for another 6 months. She had a way of taking things too far, of overcorrecting in a ridiculous way. Eloise had been level-headed and smart. She'd taken down all the information, and she'd remained optimistic that everything would work out. At age 16, Robin didn't have quite the long-range perspective she did now, and hitting that truck had felt like the end of the world. She was sure Eloise felt like that right now. She'd been waiting for this wedding for her entire life, and Robin's resolve that she would have absolutely everything she wanted hardened. The door opened again, and Eloise didn't even commit to coming all the way out into the viewing area. "This is a no." Robin tried to get out of the chair and couldn't quite manage it. She said, "Oof," and fell back, giving up. "No," she said, taking in the form-fitting mermaid dress. "That's not for you." "Let me just try the penis," Sabrina said, squeezing out behind Eloise. "You go in and start unzipping that one. I'll be right back." She hustled off, and Robin met Eloise's eyes. "I don't mind that other one," Eloise said. "Yes, but we don't want a dress we don't mind," Robin said. Using both hands, she pushed herself out of the chair. "I'm going to call Mike, just to see how he's feeling." "It's not bad." "Elle, honey, the fabric is from the 80s, she said, "and everyone and their dog has worn it." Both things weren't deal breakers, but Robin wasn't going to give in too easily. She ignored the list of things she needed to do that day. There was nothing that required her attention more than this, as her next wedding wasn't for 2 more weeks after Eloise's. Whatever she'd had on her list for today after Eloise's dress pickup and fruit platter selection could wait. With a start, Robin realized she needed to call Betty about the platter, too. She watched Sabrina hustle back into the dressing room, a gorgeous dress in her arms, and Robin did her best to estimate how much longer they'd be there. Probably at least an hour. She'd call Betty first to set up a new time to pick the fruit, and then she'd call Mike. As she dialed, she ignored the quaking in her stomach. "Things will work out," she told herself. "Things will work out. They will." If they didn't, Robin didn't have a plan C. Chapter 4. "I'm fine," A.J. Proctor said as her fiancé gave her a cocked eyebrow look. Eloise needs help choosing a dress. I'll drive you, Matt Hymas said, getting to his feet. Alice is going to come get me. A.J. started toward the kitchen to put her teacup in the sink. Matt followed her, his hand on her hip the moment she arrived at the countertop. A small smile touched her face, and she leaned into his palm. How are you feeling? He asked, ducking his head closer to her neck. I'm worried about you. You got up really early. I couldn't get my legs to settle down. A.J. turned in his arms and slid her hands up his chest. I laid on the couch and fell back asleep for a little bit. He pushed her hair back and studied her face. A.J. hated what he might find because she couldn't erase her exhaustion. At the same time, she couldn't stay home this time. She felt completely isolated from her friends, though each and every one of them had been by the house to see her in the past couple of weeks. Kelli came almost every day, and A.J. had finally told her she didn't need to do that. A.J. still felt like she'd done something wrong, but she hadn't. Something bitter touched her tongue, and A.J. swallowed against it. I'd really like to go. The moment I start to feel overwhelmed or like I need a nap, I'll make Alice bring me back. Okay, Matt said. Remember, I'm going to the airport on Sunday right after the wedding to get Justin. Yes, A.J. said. I'll get a ride home with Kristen. It's all worked out. Matt and his son might beat her back here to the house, and A.J. would be lying if she said she wasn't nervous to start meeting Matt's kids. Justin, his youngest, was coming first. He'd be here about 2 weeks before Lisa would show up, and all 4 of them would be living in Matt's 3-bedroom house. Trepidation like A.J. had never known flowed through her every time she thought about it. Matt's other son, Derek, had plans for a summer visit, but dates hadn't been set yet, and plans were still liquid. The doorbell rang, and the pair of them turned toward the front door. I'll get it, Matt said. You don't need to lecture her, A.J. said, but she let him go. Matt would just murmur to Alice that she'd gotten up too early and he was worried about her. He'd tell Alice to call him if he needed to come get A.J., and she took a moment to wash her hands before she turned toward the dark-haired woman she'd known for practically her whole life. You ready, A.J.? Alice asked, smiling at her as if everything was normal. Yes, A.J. said, beyond grateful that Alice hadn't asked her how she felt. She was so tired of answering that question. She still had 3.5 months before she'd deliver her baby, and now that she'd been on bed rest for the past month, her energy was starting to improve. She had another doctor's appointment next week, and she was hoping to get cleared off of bed rest. She hadn't had a single spot of blood in weeks, and her boredom was leading her toward a complete mental breakdown. Let me grab my phone, A.J. said, detouring toward the office. Matt had gone in there, and he met her at the door, her phone in his hand. Call me if you need me to come get you, he said. I'm sure Alice will bring me back, she said, leaning forward to kiss him. A quick peck, and A.J. followed Alice toward the front door. Out on the porch, she linked her arm through Alice's and said, He told you the same thing, right? He's sweet, Alice said kindly. He's worried about you and his baby. Yeah, A.J. sighed as she reached the ground. You don't think he is? I think he is, A.J. said. I'm just worried all we're ever going to talk about again is how I'm feeling. Alice peeled out a round of laughter that made A.J.'s heart take flight. It feels like that, doesn't it? She escorted A.J. all the way to the passenger seat. When I was pregnant with the twins, I was huge. Like as big as your house huge. I couldn't go anywhere or do anything without every single human being I came in contact with asking me if I was okay. She laughed again and shook her head. I'd get so many questions. How many babies are you going to have? Are you sure there's just 2 in there? Why are you out of the house? You should be in the hospital. AJ opened the door and eased into the passenger seat. Alice closed the door behind her and went to get behind the wheel. I promise, AJ, I will not ask you how you're feeling. I noticed you didn't, AJ said, and I appreciate that. She buckled her seatbelt, making sure it was low under her belly. I've had so many sports injuries, and all of them were worse than this. No one ever cared how I was feeling then. You do want to make sure the baby's healthy, Alice said. Of course, AJ said, leaning her head back and closing her eyes. Of course, echoed in her head. Alice might have said something else, but AJ wasn't sure. Everything softened, and the next thing she knew, Alice nudged her and said, We're here, AJ. She opened her eyes with some effort, realizing she'd fallen asleep. Sorry, she said, feeling a bit out of it. Her head swam, and she tried to focus through the windshield to the car in front of her. It took 10 minutes to drive from Matt's to Aaron's, and AJ couldn't believe she'd fallen asleep so fast. My restless legs have kept me up the past few nights, she explained to Alice, though she hadn't asked. I guess I'm just like a baby. Put me in a car and drive me somewhere and I'm out like a light. She smiled at Alice, who gave her a brilliant smile in return. You sure you want to be here? I can actually drive you around Diamond while you sleep. I've got time. No, AJ said firmly. I want to be here. I've missed so much this month already. Amelia's been coming and bringing the kids, hasn't she? Alice asked, reaching for her purse. She opened her door and got out. AJ copied her, stretching her back once she'd gotten to her feet. Yes, she said. I love it when she and the girls come. They break up the monotony of looking for another job, chasing down another lead, or writing another article. How was it going back to the freelance? Alice met her at the front of the car and hooked her arm through AJ's again. Good, AJ said in a somewhat false voice. She didn't have the same passion for sports journalism as she once had. She couldn't remember a time when sports didn't dominate her life. If she wasn't playing them, she was training to. If she wasn't doing that, she was watching them on TV. She used to record the games she really wanted to watch, then wait for her father to drink himself to sleep and watch the matches in the middle of the night. In college, she'd played soccer and volleyball. She'd written about sports. She'd graduated and gone into broadcasting. She'd interviewed hundreds of professional athletes and dated quite a few too. It was all sports all the time, and AJ was actually sick of it. Yeah, Alice said. Sounds really good. She gave AJ a look that she ignored, and they went up the steps to the house. Alice didn't ring the bell or knock, and when they walked in, a dog barked once before trotting over to them. AJ adored animals, and she bent down to pat the beast's head. Hey, you, she said, as she didn't know the dog's name. Prince, Aaron said, barking in his own way. Come on, leave the ladies alone. He smiled at Alice and AJ as he approached. She's in the bedroom, and I'm banned from even taking a step down the hall, so you'll have to find it yourself. He grabbed Prince's collar and hauled him backwards so Alice and AJ could get by. Thanks, AJ said. She walked through the kitchen, noting the absence of dinner plates on the table. A backpack sat there, with a math book open beside it, but whoever had been doing the homework wasn't around. Alice led the way down the hall, and she did knock on this door before entering the room. AJ filed in last, and she was the very last to arrive. Eloise had brought in dining room chairs, and Robin jumped to her feet. AJ, she said, come sit here. AJ would have normally hated taking Robin's seat, but she moved over to the chair without protest. Kelli reached over and took her hand, and AJ squeezed her fingers in hello. "Hello, dear," Kristen said from the next chair over, and AJ smiled at her, too. Laurel sat in the last chair, and Alice piled onto the bed with Aaron's girls, Billy and Grace. Robin stayed on her feet, her thumb in her mouth as she chewed the nail. "We're all here, Al," she called, and the tension in the room went through the roof. "Did you give them the spiel?" Eloise called back, the door remaining stubbornly closed. "No, just a sec." Robin strode toward the closed bathroom door and faced the group. "Okay, so we found a couple of replacement dresses today. Mike still thinks he can get the original dress clean, and we stopped by and saw the dress this afternoon." She surveyed the group, her expression very serious. "I personally think it's going to be fine, and she'll get to wear the original dress. But, to be safe, we got these two. They're both rentals, and they both—" She cut off as if someone had muted her. "Eloise just wants to model them both, and then we'll vote. She doesn't want comments or lists of what you like and don't like. She'll tell you how she'll alter them, if she's going to. We have to decide tonight and get the alterations done tomorrow, and Mike said he'd call me the moment the dress comes out of the solution he's tried on it tonight." "They're still open tonight?" Kristen asked. "It's 6:30. "He's staying late to work on the dress." Robin looked like she might throw up, and AJ felt bad for her. Being a wedding planner had to be such hard work. She didn't get do-overs. If something didn't go right, that was part of that couple's big day forever. She'd been working like a dog on AJ and Matt's wedding, and AJ knew the details that Robin paid attention to. There was no stone unturned, no question unasked, no deal not gotten. She was very, very good at her job, and AJ knew she needed to hear it more often. "Robin," she said, and everyone looked at her. "It's going to be so amazing. You've done so much work on this wedding, and every little detail is going to come together." "AJ's right," Alice said. "Eloise is going to look amazing no matter what, and you really have worked magic with this wedding." A soft smile touched Robin's face, and she said, "Thank you," in the quietest voice AJ had ever heard her use. She was so full of life, with such a rah-rah attitude about everything. She'd cheered in high school, and her enthusiasm had been, and still was, contagious. "Okay, Al," she called through the door, and Robin actually perched on the corner of the bed to watch the fashion show. AJ's pulse skipped a beat as she waited for Eloise to exit the bathroom and show them the dress. Finally, the door opened, and Eloise came through the door, her very full skirt bunching on the sides before it made it through. AJ loved big, flowing, prom-style dresses, and her wedding dress was very much like that. Huge, puffy sleeves with a scooping neckline to show off the best parts of her body. The fabric clung to her torso and then, from the waist down, billowed in waves and waves of fabric to the floor. This dress wasn't quite that full and majestic, but the feathers on the bottom were stunning. AJ pulled in a breath and wondered why they hadn't bought this dress to begin with. "I hate the sleeves on this one," Eloise said, "but they can take them off and have simple, wide straps." She turned around to show off the long train in the back, and then she headed back into the bathroom. "That was pretty," Kelli said, and AJ smiled at her. "I agree. Hey, whatever happened with you the other night? You said you'd call me when you two got back to Pearl, but I never heard from you." Kelli and Shad had come to dinner at AJ and Matt's, and after a great dinner Matt had picked up at Morty's, they'd sat on the back deck with coffee and wine. AJ had sipped water because coffee made the baby kick her all night, and she obviously couldn't drink wine. Kelli had told her that Shad had mentioned taking a trip together because his parents were getting older and he always went to visit them in the summertime. They lived on Long Island, and he'd suggested he and Kelli could go for a few days, especially since she wasn't tied to a job here, or wouldn't be come tomorrow, which was her last day at the school. She hadn't been sure she could take a trip with Shad. She'd worried about Parker, and AJ had assured her she could go with Shad and that any number of people would watch Parker while she was gone. So they wouldn't be whispering among themselves, Kelli had said she'd call when she got home. She hadn't. "Oh, I don't know," Kelli said. "I guess I forgot." Her very best friend in the whole world wouldn't look at her, and AJ's stomach dropped. Not because of anything to do with the baby, but because she was fairly sure Kelli had just lied to her. "You forgot?" she asked. But Eloise opened the door and said, "I need some help in here." Robin jumped to her feet, and AJ watched as Kelli turned slightly toward Kristen and asked her if Reuben still went out to the claw. AJ pulled her hand away from Kelli, stung and a bit unsure as to why Kelli didn't want to talk to her now. Perhaps she doesn't want to say anything in front of so many people, AJ thought. She looked at Kelli, and she sure seemed normal. Perhaps AJ was reading too much into things. Maybe she just needed to come right out and ask if she decided to take the trip with Shad or not. Determined to do that before she went home that night, AJ let Kelli put her off for now, and she simply waited for Eloise to come out in the second wedding dress. Chapter 5. Laurel Baker frowned at her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. "That can't be right," she said, knowing she needed to put her device away and have this conversation another time. If she carried on for too much longer, Alice would notice and want the details. Robin sat only a few feet from her, and that woman didn't miss much of anything. "I'll call you when I'm done here." She sent both texts and looked up just as Eloise stepped out of the bathroom again. Her heart pounded in her chest the way it had when she'd been in her terrible relationship and subsequent bad marriage. Her anxiety had started high tonight because Laurel still had a lot of nerves about getting married. She glanced down at the diamond engagement ring on her hand, completely distracted from the oohing and awing going on around her. She forced herself out of her mind, telling herself she wanted to marry Paul and that she could deal with her troubling case later. She didn't have to take the job with her everywhere she went. This dress had real charm, as it showed off Eloise's bare shoulders and lifted her chest in a way the other one didn't. The fabric wasn't quite as shiny either, but a softer version of the bright white, almost yellow, of the other dress. It looked almost gauzy and lightweight as it flowed over Eloise's body. A bright blue sash went around her waist, bunching up some fabric that spilled upward in an elegant arc and sending the rest to the floor in wavy layers of fabric, almost like the effect of a waterfall frozen in motion. Everyone clearly liked this dress more. Laurel did, and by the glow on Eloise's face, she did too. "Okay," Robin said, standing up, and Laurel hoped this get-together would end soon. With it being a school night and all, surely all the moms in the group would need to get home and get their kids to bed. Laurel glanced at Alice, who spoke to Billy and Grace with a wide smile on her face. Or go on dates with their hot boyfriends. Alice was very good at keeping secrets behind closed doors, and Laurel trusted her completely. She wouldn't betray Alice's confidence to anyone, and she frowned again as her phone buzzed against her thigh 3 times in a row. She'd come straight from the station to this emergency dress meeting, and she needed to get back there. Tom had gotten the air traffic controller's report for the drug case they'd been investigating, and it didn't add up. "Laurel," Robin said, and she looked up at the woman. She held out a piece of paper and a pen. "It's time to vote." "Right," Laurel said, having missed the instructions. "There's 6 of us," AJ said. "Why can't we just hold up 1 finger for the first dress and 2 for the second?" "Just write the number on the paper," Robin said, her voice tight. Eloise had disappeared, probably back into the bathroom to change, and Laurel told herself to be present. She scrawled a big 2 on the paper and handed it back to Robin without folding it. Robin did that, as if this was some big mystery surprise, and Laurel's skin itched to get back to her real mystery. She'd been moved to the narcotics department in the last week, and while she'd need time to adjust to her new partner and new job, she didn't want to take too long. She wanted to show Chief Sherman and everyone in narcotics that she was a talented detective. She'd been working as a regular police detective for several years now, usually assigned to property vandalism or robbery cases on the North 2 Islands in the Cove. The move to narcotics was a step up, not a lateral reassignment, and she was the only female in that department at the moment. Weight had settled on her shoulders and around her neck the moment Chief Sherman had asked her if she could make the move. She'd held her head high and said yes, of course. She was ready to move to a smaller department, with bigger cases and more tension. She was. She wanted to prove to everyone that she had the talent, the mind, and the skill to get the job done. "Looks like dress number 2, Robin said as Eloise re-entered the bedroom, now back in her regular clothes. For some reason, the women started clapping, and Laurel joined in. She smiled at Eloise, because she did love the woman, and she did want her wedding to go off without a hitch. The entire Five Island Cove Police Department would be there, half of them actually getting paid to work the crowd and keep the chief and his new bride, his girls, and his parents safe. They were high-profile figures in the Cove, and his father was running for mayor. Stress accompanied Aaron Sherman wherever he went, and the whole department had sat through a debriefing meeting for 2 hours yesterday morning where the only topic discussed had been Sunday's wedding. Laurel wondered if Eloise even knew that. She wasn't a stupid woman, but she did bring cookies and sub sandwiches into the station as if it were an office building full of businessmen. It wasn't. They handled criminal cases from big things like homicide to small things like a stolen bike. All the cops liked Eloise, though, and Laurel couldn't fault her for wanting to steal a kiss from Aaron in the middle of the day. The man worked insane hours, as did his deputy chief, who was Laurel's fiancé. Second thoughts ran through her mind again, and her phone vibrated a couple more times. Her nerves teetered on the edge of a cliff, and she got to her feet. "Congrats, Eloise," she said, taking the woman into a hug. "Either of those dresses will be gorgeous." "We're still going to see about the original dress," Robin said, as if Laurel or Eloise needed to be reminded. "I'm so sorry," Laurel said, holding up her phone, "but I have to run. My new partner doesn't understand the idea of clocking out once 5 o'clock hits." She flashed a smile around at everyone. "Be safe," Eloise said, a worried look in her eye. "I will." Laurel reached out and squeezed Robin's hand. "We're still on for next Thursday?" Her schedule had changed with her new appointment, but she should have Thursdays off from now on. Narcotics detectives did a lot more work on the weekends, that was for sure. And Laurel had already started to feel that pain only 10 days into the new job. "Yes," Robin said. "I'll have lunch in my office too, and I promise we won't get interrupted this time." Laurel released her hand and waved it, as if Robin's argument with her mother hadn't bothered Laurel at all. It had, however, and she needed to do something about that too. She couldn't carry around the negative emotions from others, and as she hurried out of the bedroom and down the hall, Laurel knew she needed to get back into therapy. She'd missed a couple of sessions, and she could feel herself spiraling. She didn't want to marry Paul. She couldn't imagine going shopping for a wedding dress. She absorbed the bad energy and confrontational vibe from everyone around her. Her mind spinning, she got behind the wheel of her police car. She gripped the wheel and took a deep breath. "Slow down, Laurel," she said, looking straight ahead. She'd parked on the street so she wouldn't get boxed in when the others arrived, and as she watched a man and his wife walk their dog, the world started to come back into focus. She breathed in slow, the way she'd learned to do, and she isolated her thoughts from one another. Alice was seeing Arthur that night, and Laurel now knew they were doing a lot more than just going to dinner. Robin was stressed to a 10, and Laurel had the distinct thought that she should send dinner to her family. Not only was this the wedding of the year, and Robin was in charge of it, her daughter was going through a breakup, and her husband was leaving to fish the waters around Alaska in just a few weeks. Eloise was getting married in 2 days, and her dress had been ruined. Laurel couldn't do much about that, but her presence tonight to vote on the dress had been good for her, and probably good for Eloise. Kelli, Kristen, and AJ all had things going on in their lives: a new boyfriend, upcoming moves, meeting important people, and another wedding in only 4 more weeks. Laurel blew out her breath and picked up her phone. She called Tom without reading his texts and said, "I'm on my way back to you. I couldn't read your text, so fill me in." 20 minutes later, Laurel lowered the paper she'd been reading. "I still don't think it's right." It couldn't be. Tom looked up from the newspaper he held. Yes, he still read the newspaper because he was about 15 years older than Laurel. She remembered celebrating his 50th birthday right here in the station last year. Last summer, she thought. So he was almost 51. He had a head full of silver hair with a mustache and beard to match. He kept everything neatly trimmed, and he still looked like he could bench press more than Laurel weighed. She had no idea if he was happy she was his new partner or not. He'd never indicated he was unhappy about it, but he hadn't rushed at her with open arms when the introduction was made either. He'd nodded to her and thrown back another handful of pistachios. The man adored pistachios, and at least Laurel would know what to get him for his birthday. Tom had a wife and kids, though his 2 boys were grown and graduated. One had moved to the mainland to do a cybersecurity program, and one had finished his police training and taken a job on the island of Nantucket. They'd bonded over that, as Laurel's parents lived in Nantucket. Tom was easy to talk to, and Laurel wouldn't hesitate to tell him what she thought. "What's not right about it?" Tom asked. "That's the report from the air traffic controller." "Who's no longer working at the airport." Laurel put the paper on her desk and looked up at the ceiling. He could be disgruntled. He could be making it up. It doesn't feel complete. "We know there are drugs coming into the cove via land and air," Tom said. "Marsden was caught with it on his person and in his luggage. The stories corroborate." "Do they?" Laurel got up and walked through the empty station. A few night cops worked near the front doors, but the narcotics department got a quiet corner far from the regular comings and goings of police activity. "Yes," Tom said slowly. "Marsden gave us all the dates he'd been in the cove. They match up with that report." Something niggled at her mind, but Laurel couldn't find the details she needed. An increase in drugs, particularly methamphetamines and cocaine, had been surging in the cove for the past year, and Chief Sherman wanted to put a stop to it. Since the cove was an isolated chain of 5 islands that ran north to south about 12 miles off the coast of mainland New York, the only way the drugs could be getting here was through the air or on a boat. After that, people could cook them up, and 2 sets of detectives were working those cases. Harold Marsden had been trafficking cocaine into the cove for the past 8 months, and an undercover officer had finally learned about him and set up a deal to buy the drugs. That had turned into a sting operation, and they'd actually arrested Marsden at the airport, with drugs sewn into his clothes and bags stowed with his toiletries and his carry-on. He'd been sitting in the basement jail for over 3 weeks while the case got investigated. Tom and his previous partner had interviewed him. When Laurel had been reassigned, she had too. She went back to her desk and pulled out her notebook with the interview transcript in it. She could read her messy handwriting, though not many others could. She flipped a few pages, because she'd then interviewed all the airport personnel as well. Tom had humored her and let her do the interviews, though he had notes from the initial interrogations. Scanning quickly, she went past Marsden's claim that he didn't know who funded his plane tickets. He made the drug drop in the library's book return, late at night, on specified dates. He always got texts from different numbers with the code word Dumbo in them so he'd know he was talking to the guy above him. He didn't know who it was. He'd been approached by the air traffic controller, a one Lucas Winters, because he'd noticed how often Marsden came to the Cove. He did fly back and forth because he owned a vacation rental on Rocky Ridge, and he came to the Cove after every stay to get the house cleaned up and put back together for the next guest. The two of them had been moving cocaine into the Cove for 8 months. 8 months, Laurel mused, picking up the paper. This only goes back to November. She turned the report toward Tom. Where's September and October? I don't know. Tom took the paper from her, a frown on his face. Marsden's been coming to the Cove for years, Laurel said, not just the past 6 months. We have no way to trace who bought the airplane ticket. He didn't always come by plane, Tom said, his voice distracted as he studied the report. What? Laurel asked. So he flew into Nantucket, then took the steamer? Why would he do that? Unless he'd chartered a boat to the Cove, that was the only other way to get to the islands. Plane or steamer from Nantucket. That was more of a tourist experience than something a person would use for commuting, but it was a viable way into the Cove. Charters would have records, Laurel said. We should request all of those from all the docks, especially the one on Rocky Ridge. Yes, Tom said. We should go pay Mr. Winters another visit, too. He put down the paper and got to his feet. I need to stew on this. Let's get out of here. There's something not right, Laurel said, scanning her documents again. She picked up the report and tucked it into her notebook. She put that in her bag to take home with her. It's almost too perfect, like they planned it all to keep us from finding the truth. They're criminals, Tom said with a sad smile. That's what they do. They're protecting someone, she said. Someone big, I can feel it. She shouldered her bag and started to leave. Tom put up his hand. Stop for a minute here, he said quietly. Think about what you just said. The Cove is a small place. There are only a few big people here. He held up one finger. The mayor, and this is an election year, so you've got the guy trying to unseat the current mayor. He put up a second finger as Laurel's lungs began to ice over. Greg Sherman was running for mayor, and yes, he was one that Laurel would consider someone big. He was also Aaron's father. A third finger went up. You have the chief of police, or someone close to him. He looked at his fingers while pure horror moved through Laurel. Aaron? It couldn't be Aaron. Tom continued with, maybe one more. A big businessman, like the guy who owns those 4 resorts, or someone who's buying up land, like the guy who just bought that golf course on Rocky Ridge to fix it up. Someone with money. A lot of money. Laurel swallowed, because Matt Hymas and his father, Yancey, had bought the old golf course on Rocky Ridge to fix it up and add it to the one they ran here on Diamond Island. There are others in government, she said. Restaurant owners who could easily distribute. It's not a scandal if a crab shack owner is peddling drugs out of his beachside taco stand, Tom said. You said someone big. Laurel's gut didn't usually lie to her. She met Tom's eyes, and they simply looked at one another. We need to be careful, she said quietly. That we do, he agreed. I'll call Mel on the way home, and we'll meet with him in the morning. Then we need to go see this air traffic guy again. I'll make a list of all the ways on and off the islands, Laurel said. Any island from all sides. That decided, they walked out of the station together, both of them nodding to the night secretary as they did. As Laurel pulled up to Paul's house, she realized he could probably be classified as someone big, too. It would certainly be a scandal if the number 2 in the police department had been running drugs into the cove for the past year. Please don't let it be anyone I know personally, she prayed as she got out of her car. And no one connected to any of my friends. Please. Chapter 6. Kelli Thompson stepped into the office at the junior high for the last time and lifted her lanyard from around her neck. Sadness pulled through her at the same time excitement leapt into the back of her throat. She'd miss checking in here each morning. She'd miss working with the kids and the teachers. She'd miss feeling like she belonged to a group of people, but she told herself she had her friends, and she'd be able to attend the Wednesday lunches. Her mom and Devin spent time with her and Parker, too, and bridges were being rebuilt all over her family with her sisters. She also had Shad Webb, the man she'd been seeing for about a month now, and he'd been a great support to her. In fact, he'd texted 10 minutes ago to say he was waiting out in the circle drive whenever she was finished. "Headed out?" Barb asked, coming out of Dr. Pratt's office. The principal followed her, and both women smiled at Kelli. "We're going to miss you so much." Dr. Pratt folded Kelli into her arms. Kelli hugged her back, the scent of the professional woman reminding her of Alice, always put together with jewelry and perfume every single day. Kelli was lucky to get out of the house with her lunch and Parker. He sometimes forgot his homework, and she was sorely looking forward to days where they didn't have to rush out to catch the ferry. "I'm going to miss everyone here," she said, stepping back. "I have my badge." She handed it to Barb, who tossed it on her desk and hugged Kelli, too. "We got you a bread basket," she said, indicating the huge basket perched on the counter where parents came to ask questions. The main office didn't handle money or attendance issues, and that kept the foot traffic to a minimum in here. "My goodness," Kelli said, eyeing the blueberry lemon bread. "I'm going to eat all of this by Monday." The three of them laughed together, and Kelli experienced another moment of hesitation. Then she said, "I'll send you guys free passes to the wellness center when it opens." "June 15th, Dr. Pratt said. "I've already got it on my calendar." "Me too," Barb said, "because that's the week after school gets out and I'm going to need a full-body massage." "We can do that," Kelli said, giggling with them. She looked past them to the wide windows that showed the front parking lot. A sigh filled her body. "Okay, well, I'm off." "Good luck," Barb and Dr. Pratt said at the same time, and Kelli turned to leave. She walked out of the office and then out of the junior high. She'd been working here for several months, and the job had given her confidence in the wake of a divorce. She'd been able to provide for herself and her son, and she loved the little twin home where she lived on Pearl Island. She strode toward the dark blue government car, and Shad emerged from the driver's seat. A smile rode on his lips, and Kelli laughed and ran the last few feet to him. He caught her in his arms and lifted her up. "Done," he said, not asking. "Done." She braced herself against his shoulders and leaned down to kiss him. She didn't care if other teachers saw. Even students were fine. Before, Kelli would never have displayed any affection in public, but today felt like the first day of the rest of her life. She felt free to do what she'd always wanted to do. And while she knew opening a yoga studio wouldn't be a walk through the park, she just knew it would bring her the happiness that had eluded her for so long. Shad laughed as he broke the kiss. "Come on, sweets. Let's go get Parker and go to dinner to celebrate." She nodded, her smile seemingly etched into her face as she went around to the passenger seat. The moment she buckled, Shad asked, "Dare I ask if you've thought more about going to Long Island before the wellness center opens?" Kelli sighed before she could stop herself. I have, she said quickly. I just. When Eloise was getting ready to open Cliffside, she was crazy busy, like all over the place. She had a lot of help, but she worked 15-hour days. She looked at Shad, but he kept his eyes forward as he pulled away from the curb. I'm just worried I'll say yes and then I won't be able to go. I can't predict what the first week of June will look like. Let's go for the 4th then, he said. They do a big celebration with fireworks right over the water. He glanced at her and then looked left to check for traffic. Kelli's stomach quaked. She didn't know how to go on a trip with her boyfriend. She had never done that before, and she had Parker to consider. She wasn't sure if she was ready to meet Shad's parents, and if she were being really honest, she wasn't sure she wanted to get so close to New Jersey again. Talk to me, Shad said gently. I can't read your mind. Kelli took a deep breath. This part of her relationship with a man brand new for her too. Julian hadn't really wanted to know what Kelli thought. His focus had always been on his business, and the more she looked back on their marriage, the more she realized that she'd just been a helper to him. A side note, a second thought. I've never gone on a trip with my boyfriend, she said. I'm not sure I'm ready to meet your parents. I don't know what will happen with Parker, as Julian still hasn't called me back about if he'd like his son for the summer or not. A week here, 2 or 3, or the whole thing. She sure would like to plan something for July, but she didn't feel like she could. It'll be completely innocent, he said. We can stay in separate bedrooms. I'm not trying to pressure you into anything. Kelli nodded and folded her hands in her lap to get them to stop moving. I appreciate that. She did like spending time with Shad. He lit up her world and made her heart do things it hadn't done in a long time. She sure enjoyed kissing him, and when he let his hand drift down the side of her neck to her shoulder and then to her waist, she relished his touch. My parents won't think anything of it, he said. It doesn't mean we're more or less serious, though I just have to say. He cleared his throat. I'm serious about this already. Kelli's chest pinched, and she looked at Shad again, pure surprise pulling through her. You are? Remember how long it took me to ask you out? He chuckled, and an adorable pink hue touched his face. Yeah, I'm serious. Kelli drew in a breath, and everything tight in her chest released. She reached over and took his hand in hers, noticing how quiet hers stayed with his to hold. I'll call Julian tonight after we get home. Shad swallowed, the movement in his throat making Kelli smile. All right. All right, Kelli said. If it works out with Parker, and I can ask Eloise or Alice to take him if he'll be in the Cove when we go to Long Island, let's plan for July instead of June. She swallowed, too, her nerves going down easier than she'd anticipated. July it is, Shad said, grinning as he joined the pickup line for the elementary school. They got out a bit later than the junior high, but they wouldn't have to wait long. The moment Shad put the car in park, Kelli leaned over and drew his face toward hers. She kissed him, the gentle stroke of his mouth against hers working up to something more passionate and fevered. Heat filled Kelli, and she slowed the kiss so she could enjoy every touch of his hands in her hair, along her face, and down her side. Kelli glanced at Parker on the couch, a bowl of popcorn in his hands and his favorite dragon movie playing. She didn't want to introduce tension and conflict into this perfect evening, but she'd promised Shad she'd call Julian tonight. At nearly 9 p.m., the man should be home from work. Anything was possible, and Kelli had known him to pull all-nighters if a job required it. She dialed and went upstairs without saying anything to her son. The line rang and rang, and Julian didn't answer until she'd reached the top of the steps. Cal, he said easily, as if she'd be calling to offer to bring him a bread basket. She wished she'd brought up one of the oatmeal raisin cookies to help her through this conversation. Hey, she said, her voice slightly meek. She told herself she wasn't the meek, nervous Kelli she'd been in her marriage. She was strong now. She didn't need Julian, but she could be civil. We're only 6 weeks away from summer vacation, she said. I need to know what you'd like to do with your son. Her voice sounded strong now. She'd phrased nothing as a question, nor had she demanded. A nice request. That was what she'd done. Let's see, Julian said, already distracted by something else, as if his own child didn't deserve his full attention. Frustration built within Kelli, but she stayed silent. We'd love to have him all summer, Julian said. He's done on June 7th? Yes, Kelli said, blinking at the idea of not having Parker with her at all this summer. She hadn't anticipated Julian requesting that. Her heart stalled completely as she realized he'd said we. Who's we? Kelli asked, her voice much too high now. She knew who it would be. Tiff and I, he said, clearing his throat. I guess I better tell you. It's not like you're not going to find out. She's living with you, Kelli said, getting control of the squeakiness in her tone. We got married last week, he said, and that did cause Kelli to produce a loud gasp. She leaned against the wall for support, the word, married? Escaping her mouth before she could call it back. Yes, he said, and she could just see him glaring at her, daring her to contradict him. Nasty comments and questions piled beneath her tongue, and Kelli breathed deeply to keep them submerged. He's got to be back on August 30th? Julian asked, as if he hadn't just dropped a bomb. Yes. The word scraped her throat. I'd like him back in time to do some school shopping and meet his teacher. How about we come get him on June 11th? We'll bring him back on August 11th. That's 2 months, and you'll have him for a couple of weeks before school starts. Kelli started shaking her head in the middle of his question. No, she said, pushing herself back to a full standing position. You'll come get him in June, and I'll come pick him up in August. I don't want Tiff here. She couldn't even imagine sending her son to live with that woman and her ex-husband for 2 months. Every cell in her body trembled, and tears filled her eyes. She pressed against them and added, If she harms my son in any way, Julian, I will make sure you never see him again. Come on, Kelli, he scoffed. Don't be petty and vindictive. It doesn't suit you. Don't lecture me, she blurted out. I don't like her, and I don't want to send Parker to spend any time with her. I will because the court says I must, but I'm not joking. I know a lot of lawyers, and Parker's not an infant. He knows what you've done and why we got divorced, and he'll tell me if he's uncomfortable in any way. He's not going to be uncomfortable in the house where he grew up. With another mother. Kelli did the scoffing now. Julian was so clueless sometimes. Parker wasn't grown up. He was 10 years old, with plenty of childhood left. Is she the only woman you have in the house, Julian? How dare you? He asked. I don't have to answer that. Yes, you do, Kelli said. I can go to the judge right now and say I don't want my son exposed to a brothel. My house is not a brothel, he spat out. It's just me and Tiff. I'll be asking Parker, Kelli said, though the idea of putting her son between her and Julian made her sick. You do what you have to do, Julian said, and that only fueled Kelli's fury. He said stuff like that, but he didn't mean it. He'd always wanted her to do what he wanted to do. I'll come alone on the 11th of June to get him. Kelli took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she held the phone to her ear. I'll have him ready for the summer. Silence poured between them, and Kelli pressed her eyes closed, wishing she could keep the memories she had with this man from flowing through her mind. She couldn't, though, and she did have good memories mixed in with the more recent bad ones. "Thank you, Kelli," Julian said, and the call ended. She exhaled and let her hand drop. She turned around, her mind racing as fast as her heart. Her feet took her quickly down the steps, and she called to Parker, "I'm running next door for a minute. I'll be right back," as she ran out the front door. She rounded the short, wrought iron fence that separated her house from Shad's and pounded on the door. "Shad?" she called. "It's just me." His footsteps approached quickly on the other side of the door, and he opened it, his eyes wide. "What's wrong?" She stepped into his arms and let the few remaining tears in her eyes fall. "He's going to take him for the whole summer." "Hey, it'll be okay," Shad whispered as he stroked her hair. "I'm here, and Cal, you can put it on your friend's text, and everyone will come support you." She pulled away from him and looked into his eyes. "You're right. I'm going to do that right now." He smiled at her and leaned down. "Maybe after I kiss you." He claimed her mouth, and Kelli's fantasies formed and went wild. Parker would be gone for 2 whole months, and she'd be living right next door to this stunningly handsome and thoughtful man. He backed up, taking her with him, and closed the door before he pressed her into it, kissing her deeper and deeper before moving his mouth to her neck and murmuring, "It's going to be a great summer, Kel. You'll see." Chapter 7. Kristen Shields picked up her purse and followed her son and daughter-in-law up the steps from the subterranean levels of the lighthouse. The steps had become harder and harder for her to climb, but Reuben and Jean waited for her at the doorway, and Jean gave her a kind smile. She'd changed so much in the past 8 months, and Kristen wondered how much Parker Thompson had to do with that. She wondered if Kelli had texted Jean that the boy would be gone for most of the summer. Kristen said nothing, because it wasn't her place to spill the beans if she hadn't. "Thanks for coming with me to look at places," Kristen said. "I'm more nervous than I thought I'd be." "Yeah?" Reuben asked, holding the door for his wife and then Kristen. "Why do you think you're nervous?" "I don't know," Kristen admitted. "I've never looked at houses before. I've not moved in 50 years. "You've cleaned out that cottage so well," Jean said. "Moving won't be too terribly hard, I wouldn't think." "It shouldn't be," Reuben said. "You live like a minimalist almost, Mom." She smiled at her son, but she didn't contradict him. Since her husband's death a little over a year ago, Kristen had been digging out from under a mountain of papers, books, journals, clothes, and secrets. She had gotten rid of many, many things. Hundreds of pounds of things Joel had stuffed into the house, and every time Kristen thought about it, her shoulders sagged under the weight of the memories. She'd been buried in that house, and now she was going to leave it behind. "I can ride in the back," she said quickly, when she saw Jean reaching for the door handle on the back door of the SUV. "I'll move my seat forward," Jean said, opening the door anyway. Kristen smiled at her and ducked into the vehicle. With everyone in, Kristen handed her phone to Reuben so he could navigate them to the first property. "Linny will meet us there," she said, settling back against the seat and looking out the window. The sky held a brilliant blue hue today, without a single cloud in sight. Sometimes the sea spray would fire up into the sky when a particularly large wave hit the rocks below. She saw nothing of that today, and she took a breath and held it for a moment. Reuben backed out of the parking stall and headed down the curved road that led to town. It wasn't a long drive, as the islands weren't huge. but it still took about 15 minutes to arrive at the first condo. Kristen took in the wide, open gate, the neatly trimmed grass, and the golden bricks that marked the pillars in the fence line. 3-story buildings started, with covered carports in the parking lot they now drove slowly through. "This is nice, Mom," Reuben said, leaning down to peer out the windshield, too. "Some of the tallest trees on the island, I'd say." The trees didn't grow very tall in Five Island Cove because the wind didn't allow it. The roots couldn't get very deep into the rocky island, and yes, these were about 6 or 8 feet tall, which was about as tall as trees got here. Kristen swallowed, determined not to fall in love with the outside of the house first. She wasn't going to fall in love with the very first condo she looked at, period. "It should be right down here," Reuben said slowly. "Look, Kristen," Jean said. "They have a dog park right here on site. You could get that dog you want." Kristen had mentioned that she'd like a little friend to help ease the loneliness in the evenings. She'd been spending a lot of time with her girls, and with Reuben and Jean, but when she moved, she wouldn't be as close to them as she was now. She told herself she could get a rideshare and go to the lighthouse anytime she wanted to. She told herself a lot of things, and Kristen did her best not to tell Reuben to keep going and take them all home. "Do they have activities here?" Reuben asked. "Yes," Kristen said. "It's a 55-plus community. No yard work. I get my own parking space, and they have a big clubhouse where they do things." She'd done a little research online, and she had 3 appointments with her realtor to see the available units on Diamond Island. There were only 3 such communities in the cove, as the 4th and 5th were full, with waiting lists. "That must be Linny," Reuben said, swinging his SUV into an uncovered parking spot. Kristen took a deep breath and unbuckled her seatbelt. Jean stood nearby when she got out, and Kristen reached for her hand. She squeezed it quickly before stepping to greet Linny. "What do you think?" Linny swept her arm toward the nearest condo building. "There are 5 buildings here. It's one of the smaller retirement communities in the cove, which can be good and bad." She started toward the hallway running right through the middle of the building. "Can we hear the ocean?" Reuben asked, looking west. "Yes," Linny said, with delight in her voice. She had auburn hair that curled naturally and flounced against her shoulders as she walked in her heels. Today, she wore a skirt suit in dark blue with a pink blouse under the jacket with navy heels. She carried a brown leather portfolio in her arm, and Kristen felt like she was in good hands with Linny. "Isn't that great?" she asked. "They have a viewing area, too, with picnic tables. It's wonderful, and we'll get to see all of that. Come on, Kristen, your unit is right on the other side of this building." She continued to talk about the common green space Kristen's condo would border and how many units were in each building. 12, so there were only 60 condos here. Kristen had requested one on the ground level because she didn't want to deal with stairs, and as Linny pressed in the code on the lockbox of the unit on the bottom left-hand side, Kristen gazed at the green space her realtor had spoken of. "It's beautiful," she said. "It looks like it has a walking path, Mom," Reuben said, linking his arm in hers. "And the dog park is just a building down, and the picnic area she just talked about is right there." He pointed to the left, where a gate led out into an area where Kristen could see a pavilion with tables. Her heart grew and expanded, and all of her nerves disappeared. Her girls had all sent support for her endeavor today, and Robin had even offered to come. But Kristen couldn't pull her from the last-minute wedding preparations she needed to attend to for Eloise's wedding. She couldn't wait to tell them about this place, and she smiled as she turned to enter the condo. "Okay," Linny said with a big exhale. "You enter into the living room, with your dining room right here as well. It all flows right into the kitchen, and aren't those huge windows amazing?" Compared to the cottage where Kristen had lived for the past several years and the cramped lighthouse where she'd raised her 2 kids, the condo was flat out amazing. It was light, airy, and absolutely huge with 2 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. She knew she could be happy here, and she looked in every bedroom, every cupboard, and every closet. Lenny talked, and she led them down the walking path, past the grills and fire pits, and past a patch of lawn for horseshoes, cornhole, and croquet. Kristen heard the ocean before she saw it, and her breath came in puffs by the time she caught a glimpse of the waves. The wind she loved so fiercely blew in her face, and she turned further into it, feeling the vastness of the world in front of her. She clutched her arms around herself and tried to feel the right thing to do. "This is wonderful," she said to Reuben, and of course, Lenny heard. "This is a very nice place," the realtor said, "but let's go look at Beach Acres." Lenny led the way back to the parking lot, and Kristen waited until she'd sealed herself in her son's SUV before she said a word. "So?" Jean asked, turning almost all the way around in the front seat to look at Kristen, who rode behind her. "I really like that place," Kristen admitted. "I love that it's the back building, I like that I'm close to that lookout, and I like that my view is of grass and trees and not the parking lot." "It's bigger than where you are now," Reuben said. "Only by a bathroom," Kristen said. "Mom." He backed out of the spot and followed Lenny's convertible through the parking area. "No, the living area is twice as big. You could actually get a full-sized couch in there. You could never do that in that cottage." "The kitchen is huge," Jean added. "I think I'll come there to make dinner." She grinned at Kristen, who felt so much lighter than she had 25 minutes ago. She hadn't been sure if this move would bring her the closure and illuminate the path forward the way she hoped it would, but she felt differently now. Kristen smiled back at Jean. "Thanks for coming with me," she said. "I appreciate you two so much." "Of course," Reuben said, and Jean twisted back to face the front, something quick crossing her face. Kristen wasn't sure what it was, but it didn't look good. "It's just down the street to the left," Kristen said, though Reuben could see the bright red car in front of her. She saw Jean reach across the console and take Reuben's hand in hers. He lifted it to his lips and gave her a quick smile before making the turn to follow Lenny. A few minutes later, Lenny made a right turn, and they drove away from the beach for a block or two. Kristen didn't like that, but she said nothing as the homes went by the window. "Mom." Reuben cleared his throat. "We wanted to tell you something." Kristen tore her gaze from the landscape passing by, and as Reuben turned into Beach Acres, she noted that there was no fence whatsoever. The buildings didn't seem as plated in gold, as they bore a light brown stucco and not the golden hue of the bricks at the first location. "Okay," she said, trying to listen and take in details at the same time. "Jean and I turned in our adoption papers." Kristen sucked in a breath and stared at the side of her son's face. In the front seat, Jean sniffled a little bit. "You're kidding," she said. "I thought you'd decided not to do that." "Our caseworker thought we might be a little bit too old," Reuben said. "But I'm only 43 and Jean's only 40. We have plenty of time to raise a child." "Are you—" She cut herself off because she didn't want to ask if they'd stay in the lighthouse. She'd turned over complete control of the lighthouse to Reuben, and he could do what he wanted with the appointment. "Yes," Jean said. "We're going to stay in 5 Island Cove, Kristen." "You are?" Kristen didn't mean to sound so surprised, but Jean had not particularly enjoyed the cove, and she'd once gone to the mainland to visit her parents for long stretches of time. There'd been a period where Kristen was sure Reuben would either have to endure a divorce or he'd leave the cove and the lighthouse. Kristen realized now that such a thing wouldn't be the end of the world, though she had enjoyed having her son in the cove with his wife. She thought of Clara, the daughter who'd come for her father's funeral, then promptly left the cove as if Kristen had been as bad as Joel. Perhaps Kristen could try another invitation. Perhaps as a family, she could host a housewarming party, and both of her children and their spouses and children would come. For Reuben and Jean, right now, that would include a pair of dogs as well as 2 cats. She could just see them all on those picnic tables, each person carrying out a bowl of salad or a plate of hot, buttered corn on the cob. "The cove has grown on me," Jean said. "Well, I'm just thrilled," Kristen said, smiling at Jean, though the other woman didn't look at her. "And I'm glad to have something to occupy my mind, too." "Mom," Reuben said with a chuckle, "you have a lot going on. Finding a new house, moving, getting new furniture." "And all your girls," Jean said. "It's almost summertime, and you'll be going to the beach or a lunch or a picnic every single day." She did finally turn and smile over her shoulder. Kristen lifted her chin and asked, "Who said anything about new furniture?" Chapter 8. Eloise faced herself in the mirror and held the bouquet with straight arms so they made a V with the flowers right in the center. "Head down a little bit," the photographer said, and Eloise sincerely hoped the picture-taking would end soon. "To the right, please? Yes, that light is spectacular." Eloise couldn't find a spot of soot, debris, sludge, or mud anywhere on her dress, and Miriam had told her that even if a dot remained, she could take it out in post-production. Eloise didn't want to walk down the aisle in a soiled dress, but Mike had worked dry-cleaning magic, and she currently found herself buttoned and zipped into her original wedding gown. She didn't care about the $600 fee for the dress rental for the penis, though Robin said she'd take it back tomorrow and say they hadn't used it. Mike had needed 2 full days to get the wrong color out of the white fabric, and they'd needed a backup plan. Robin bustled into the room wearing her gorgeous gown. She'd changed into it a few minutes ago, which meant the top of the hour had approached. Eloise had been waiting for months to marry Aaron, and the last few hours had felt like torture. They'd been at the venue since right after lunch, and Eloise cursed herself for setting the wedding at 4 p.m. But she'd wanted a sunset-facing wedding on the beach. She wanted to serve good food, and that required a wedding that sat near a mealtime. She wanted to then leave for her honeymoon and be ready to go to bed with her husband. 4 o'clock had seemed like the perfect time, until 6 a.m. that morning. The hours from then until now had felt eternal, and as Robin told the photographer that their time was up, Eloise had never felt so grateful. "Thank you, Miriam," Robin said, and the photographer stepped toward the door. As she opened it and slipped out, Eloise caught a few notes of the music piping beyond this small structure that housed the dressing rooms for the wedding party. "Is everyone ready?" Eloise asked as she put her bouquet back in the bucket of water where it had been chilling before Miriam had wanted pictures with it. "Yes, they're coming," Robin said. "We have 5 minutes to be lined up. Duke is clearing the press right now." "Did they get the shots they wanted?" Eloise asked, though she wasn't sure why she cared. She and Aaron had given them access to some parts of the wedding, with the clear understanding that there would be no cameras, digital or video, during the ceremony and subsequent dinner. "I have no idea," she said. "There was quite the crew when Aaron's father arrived, and he stood and spoke to all of them, his perfect wife standing there with a perfect smile on her face." Robin spoke in a high-pitched, animated voice for the last several words, and she did her crazy eyes. Eloise laughed, as did Robin, and she could admit that Cindy Sherman was a tiny bit fake. Fine, maybe very fake. Her husband was running for mayor, and apparently the race was heating up early this year. She hadn't seen anything come out in the papers or on the internet yet, and perhaps the editor at the Cove Chronicles had listened to Aaron when he'd begged him to wait until after the wedding. The door opened again, and this time Alice led the way as she, AJ, Kelli, Laurel, Kristen, and then Eloise's mother entered the room. Her mom held Billy's hand and Grace's hand, and Eloise had never seen her mother glow more than when she was with Aaron's girls. Her heart warmed and expanded, and she opened her arms to her mom and the girls first. The four of them hugged, and Eloise nearly ruined her makeup, which she'd sat so very still for only a couple of hours ago. "Oh, my very favorites," she whispered. She crouched down enough to be the same height as Billy and Grace. "You're going to escort me down the aisle to your dad, right?" They'd practiced last night, and Eloise had taught them to take a step, feet together, pause, another step, step, together, pause, step. That would give Miriam time to get the pictures she wanted of them walking toward Aaron. She could get Aaron's face as he watched them come. The aisle on the beach was only 30 feet, and Aaron had marked off the distance in the hall and into the kitchen, and he'd stood at the end of it. They'd had a great night together last night, and Eloise almost wanted to bring the girls with them as they went to Italy. Not quite, but almost. "What's it like out there?" she asked, her nerves pressing against the back of her throat. "Busy," Alice said, and Eloise stepped into her arms. "I'm so excited for you, Eloise." "Thank you." Eloise didn't want to let go of her, but the moment she did, Kelli stood there, and she hugged Eloise too. She said nothing, but Kelli wore most of her emotions right out in the open on her face, and she shone with happiness. "Could be you soon," she said, as Kelli had told everyone about her July 4th trip to Long Island with Shad. Kelli lifted one shoulder and said, "Maybe." Eloise faced AJ. "How are you the most beautiful woman in that dress?" She put her hand on her belly, which protruded from the front of her body. "Please," she grinned. "You chose a wine red dress for the bridesmaids, and it's my color." She laughed and drew Eloise into an embrace. The dark red was one of her colors, and all of the dresses looked amazing on every body in the room. The dresses glinted with sequins along the bodice, with thin straps that went over the shoulders. A ruching went along the waist that hid flaws in bodies, from bony hips to extra pounds, and the color and style even looked good on Kristen. She hugged her seafaring girls leader next, her arms around the older woman as tight as she could get them. "Thank you so much for coming." "I wouldn't miss this for anything," Kristen whispered. "You're the one who includes everyone, no matter how old they are." She beamed with the power of the sun as she stepped back. Robin swooped into the space and handed Kristen a wrist corsage in a light pink carnation paired with a white one. "This goes on now," she said, stepping back and handing the last one to Laurel. Eloise knew she and Laurel still had a ways to go to be as good of friends with her as she'd like. "I'm surprised you're in here." "I've got a gun in a thigh holster," Laurel said with a grin. She reached out and hugged Eloise. "I'm working the wedding undercover." Eloise grinned as the much thinner woman gripped her shoulders. They parted, and Eloise faced Robin. The woman hadn't stopped for longer than 2 seconds in the past 3 days, and Eloise gripped her with both hands. "Robin," she said, tears filling her eyes, "you have made everything as magical and as perfect as it's going to be. Will you take off the wedding planner hat and be my friend again?" Robin brushed at her eyes and said, "Oh, all right." She stepped into Eloise's arms and hugged her, her chest heaving a little bit. For once, Eloise got to be the strong one out of the two of them, and she only stepped back when Alice said, "Someone just checked on us, and I think it's time." Eloise had been waiting her whole life for this moment. She stepped back and took her bouquet from Alice. She'd be going last with Billy and Grace, and the two girls came to her side. She positioned the flowers in front of her, not too high and not too low, as instructed. And Billy put her hand on Eloise's left arm, while Grace put hers on the right. "Is Chris here?" Eloise asked in a quiet voice.
"Yes,"
Billy whispered back.
"he's sitting with Dad's secretary. I swear, she's asked him 10 times if we're dating, and that she knows a lot of cops if he puts one toe out of line."
She rolled her eyes and huffed slightly. Eloise stifled a giggle as Robin opened the door and led the way out of the building. Eloise stepped when it was her turn, and she couldn't wait for her toes to sink into the sand. "Does your dad have Prince at the altar with him?" she asked.
"He wasn't out there when we came in,"
Billy said. "He wasn't?" A flash of worry filled her. Surely he wouldn't leave without his children, though. "Don't be ridiculous," Eloise told herself. "He's here." They'd arrived together, and Robin would have come and told Eloise immediately if anything had gone amiss with the groom. The moment Eloise emerged into the sunlight, the music changed, and the breeze picked it up and brought it back to her. She stopped to take in the sight before her. Robin had been on the beach all morning, helping to set up chairs, tie bows on them, and make sure every bloom and every bottle sat in the right place. 30 feet away, Aaron grinned at her, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He wore his dress police uniform in a crisp black with plenty of colored lines and squares on it. He wore a cap with a flat top, and everything about him called to Eloise, including the dog at his side. Without that dog, Eloise might never have reunited with Aaron. She couldn't help smiling back at him as the breeze tried to take down the arch that had been erected above the altar, which Eloise had wanted covered with pink, red, and white roses. She could see them bulging out behind Aaron, and she loved the way the long tails of the bows on the chairs seemed to be waving to her. Since it was only the end of April, the sun lowering in the western sky hadn't heated things past comfortable, and Eloise couldn't imagine a more perfect time to get married. Not a single cloud marred the blue sky, and the bottom of it had already started to glow golden in the distance. The bridal party moved down the aisle while Eloise took in the men, women, and children who'd come to witness the wedding. She saw Robin's mother near the front, as well as Alice's children standing with Parker and Shad. She smiled at her housekeepers and her inn manager, her tears rising higher and higher with each person she saw dressed in their very best, there to support her and Aaron on their big day. The scent of salt, sand, and sunshine dominated the wedding, but Eloise could also smell a hint of chocolate and a bit of the balsamic she'd chosen for the fish. Aaron had insisted on steak, and the surf and turf dinner coming in an hour or so already made Eloise's mouth water. Not nearly as much as the man waiting for her at the end of the altar. And she waited until Laurel and Paul had taken their spots on the outer edges of the altar, and everyone looked at her and her alone. "Okay, girls," Eloise said, and amid all the ribbons, bows, blooms, and roses, she took her first step toward her future. "Remember, slowly now." They moved exactly the way they'd practiced, and before she knew it, Billy had kissed her father's cheek and left Eloise alone with him at the altar. "I'm speechless," Aaron whispered, his lips right at her ear. "I'm the luckiest man in the world." "Just for this moment," Eloise whispered, and together they faced the altar and the pastor now standing there. She thought Aaron had gotten it all wrong, because the day she'd stopped at the beach and been knocked over by his dog and they'd been reintroduced had been the best day of her life. Until today.
Chapter 9. Robin dabbed at her eyes as Aaron said,
"I love you more than anything in the world,"
to finish his vows. The pastor declared him and Eloise man and wife, and the crowd started to cheer as they kissed. Eloise glowed with happiness.
and Aaron lifted their joined hands as they faced the crowd together. They got separated as her mother went to hug her, and Robin loved this part of the wedding almost more than the slow walk down the aisle and all the prep. She adored seeing all the pieces come together to create the most beautiful setting. She enjoyed watching the wonder on people's faces as they saw the way the colors came together. She'd caught the glint of joy in Eloise's eyes, and even Aaron had taken Robin by the shoulders only a few moments before Eloise had appeared and said, "Robin, I see why you're the best. Thank you for doing this for her." She'd done it for both of them. For Grace and Billy, too, because those two little girls, who weren't so little anymore, deserved an amazing start to their new family, with Eloise as their new mother. She loved those girls, and Robin did too. Duke put his hand in hers and squeezed, and Robin looked away from Eloise hugging her mother, both of them crying, and at him. "Thanks for clearing the press, baby." She tipped up and kissed him, and the stroke of his mouth suggested his desire for her. She pulled away after only a moment, because now wasn't the time. "Reminds me of our wedding," he murmured. "You did such a great job, Robin." "Thank you," she whispered back, leaning into the strength of his side and focusing on Aaron's mother as she stepped away from her son and over to her new daughter-in-law. Robin loved watching two families coming together, and she loved watching all the celebrations from friends and loved ones. Aaron currently hugged his father, and once he stepped away, Pa Leahy stepped in to clap his chief on the back. Laurel lingered nearby, her smile large and genuine as she clapped. She didn't focus on Paul and Aaron for too long, her eyes constantly moving and mostly following Greg Sherman, who was running for mayor of 5 Island Cove. She was a very good cop and a very good friend, and Robin hoped she could plan a fantastic wedding for her and Paul, too. She would. And she took a deep breath, her resolve solid. She endeavored to put on an amazing wedding for every bride, and between now and Laurel's wedding, she had 9 more nuptials to get through. AJ's was in only a month, and Robin had made a final to-do list for it she'd start on tomorrow. She watched as the mayor shook Aaron's hand, then his father's, which was such a political move. The two were running against one another this year, but Robin supposed even differences could be set aside for an hour during a wedding. The city manager, Nathan Baldwin, stepped up to Aaron and drew him into a hug. The two men laughed, and they were obviously familiar with one another. They man-clapped each other on the back, and Nathan stepped over to Eloise. Robin really had never done such a high-profile wedding, and while most of the government officials there were already married, she hoped they felt safe, secure, and would have a good time at today's wedding. "Maybe we should renew our vows next year," Duke said, interrupting her thoughts. "Then we can take that honeymoon we never really got." She looked at him again, the idea one of the best she'd ever heard. "Really?" He leaned down and pressed a kiss to her temple. "Really? We'll be caught up on everything by fall. You won't have to work yourself to death." He kept his face very close to hers, the moment intimate even among the biggest wedding the Cove had seen in a while. "I'm sorry about everything. I hate that you have to do as much as you do." "It's fine," she whispered back. "I'm glad I have the skills to be able to help our family." She would do anything for her girls and anything for Duke. She hadn't gone to college, something her mother had told her she'd regret one day. She was still waiting for that day, just like she was waiting for the day Duke would leave her, something else her mother had told her. At some point, Robin was going to have to accept that her mother was wrong. So much of what she'd learned growing up, and so much of what her mom had said had formed her. She'd once believed everything Jennifer Golden had said, and she did love her mother. But it was time to shake off the chains weighing her down. Duke wasn't going to leave her. She didn't need to go to college to plan a spectacular wedding, and get paid handsomely to do it. "Let's go say congratulations,"
Duke said, straightening.
The political crowd is clearing out. Then I'll help you check on the food.
Robin looked to her left. They should already be setting it up. Sure enough, a waiter moved among the tables, filling water glasses with ice from a metal bucket, another following him with a tall pitcher of water.
They are,
Duke said, tugging on her hand to get her to go with him.
but you'll check anyway.
He knew her so well, and Robin didn't argue. She moved through the squishy sand, edging closer while Eloise and Aaron continued to accept embraces and congratulations. Robin stepped into both of them at the same time, barely able to lift her arms around the two of them, as short as she was. Congratulations, she said, her smile instant. I love you both so much, and I'm so glad I got to be part of your special day.
You made it special,
Eloise said.
I love you, Robin. Thank you. Yes,
Aaron said.
Thank you. Everything is perfect.
She stepped back, meeting Elle's eyes first and then Aaron's. Just the dinner and dancing to go, and everything is set.
And the sunset pictures,
Elle said, and Robin nodded.
More pictures?
Aaron asked, and both Robin and Eloise started to laugh.
Family pictures,
Eloise said,
with the girls, as the sun sets into the ocean.
She put one hand on his chest as the other moved around his back.
Don't worry, Chief. I'll use them on our Christmas cards and everything. No more pictures for another year. I'm holding you to that,
he grumbled, and Robin went to check on the food. With so many VIPs here, everything had to be perfect. Yes, thank you, she said into her phone. We'll be there on Wednesday morning. She smiled as if the owner of the cake shop could see her. 10:30. She'll be so excited. The call ended, and Robin looked up as the garage door started to rumble upward. She got to her feet, wondering if she'd find Mandy or Duke coming home early. Both were equally bad. If it was Mandy, that meant something had happened at the high school bad enough to drive her back home. Something with Charlie Kelton, no doubt. The boy already had a new girlfriend, and it hurt Mandy every time she saw them together. That, or Jamie was driving her nuts with her new crush, a boy named Damian Robinson, who she'd been hanging out with more and more. Every weekend, in fact. They hadn't gone out alone, and Robin wouldn't allow that anyway, as Jamie was only 13 years old and far too young to have a real boyfriend. If Duke came through the door, that meant bad news too. It meant something had happened out on the water or with the boat, and Robin's anxiety tripled when his boots sounded in the hallway outside her office. She reached the door and their eyes met. What's going on? She asked, folding her arms across her stomach. She just needed to be calm and hold things together. Not everything was bad news, though Robin worried about such things constantly. Duke smiled, and Robin relaxed a little bit.
I ran full by mid-morning, and instead of going out again, I thought maybe we could have the afternoon to ourselves before the girls get home.
He nodded toward the kitchen.
I called for lunch, and I used food share, so it'll be here in a few minutes.
She entered the hallway and let him take her into his arms.
You don't even have to stop working, baby. I know you're busy.
I am busy, she said, starting to sway, but never too busy for lunch with my husband, the one who's leaving in 2 weeks for Alaska. She looked up at him, smiling as he danced with her right there in the house. They moved together slowly, and Robin forgot about the floral arrangements, the centerpieces, the gems she needed for the lanterns, the food for the anniversary party, and the appointment she'd just made on Wednesday morning to sample AJ's cake choices for her wedding. Only her and Duke existed, and she knew she could do anything with this man at her side. I'm going to miss you so much, she whispered.
So let's eat and hang out,
he said into her ear.
I already miss you.
While in Alaska, Duke lived in a tiny hotel cabin only a few yards from the beach. He shared with his friend Brian, and the two of them worked and worked and worked. Last summer, He'd made as much as he made here in Five Island Cove in a year in only 4 months. And this year, that money would pay off his new boat and get their family back in the black. If he went to Alaska next year, they might actually be able to buy the house from Robin's mother and take the honeymoon trip that never was. Mandy would graduate soon, and Robin wanted to give her an amazing party and send her on the trip she wanted to take, to see the mountains. They'd been talking about Calgary and the Canadian Rockies, and Robin could admit she'd like to make that trip too. She heard of lakes so blue the color couldn't even be described.
We've come a long way, baby.
Duke twirled her away from him, his grin so sexy as he pulled her back.
I love you.
I love you too. Robin kissed her husband, and he only took a break from that to bring in the food and set it on her desk before he led her down the hall to their bedroom.
Chapter 10. AJ rose to her feet as Matt's car turned into the driveway. She'd been sitting at the window for the past 30 minutes since he'd texted to say his son's flight had arrived. Justin Hymas was the youngest of his sons, having just finished his first year of college. AJ's nerves felt like they'd been put through a wood chipper, and they vibrated and screamed at her to make sure this meeting went well. Her mind blitzed from one thought to another, and she hated how loud everything shrieked through her head. If she could take her antidepressants, everything would quiet. 3 more months, she told herself, reaching for the back of the chair. She'd been attending therapy every week to learn how to control her thoughts without chemicals. She drew in a deep breath and focused on the feel of the fabric against her fingers. She thought about the temperature of the air as it moved through her nose. She breathed out, sending the panic with it. She didn't need to panic. She was going to be this boy's stepmother, even if he was already grown. She'd seen Eloise step into the role, and she'd spent most of yesterday listening to Matt talk about his youngest son. His daughter, Lisa, would be here in 2 weeks, and his other son, Derek, would be here the following week. They'd live all together in this small house in the quaint Diamond Island neighborhood for a week before AJ and Matt would get married. The front door opened, and AJ focused on the sound in that moment. She couldn't spend her time worrying about what might happen in the future. Right now, Matt's voice reached her ears, and then one slightly lower. They both laughed, and AJ smiled as she opened her eyes. She started for the doorway of the formal living room, and Matt turned toward her, catching her eye as she arrived in the foyer. There she is. He grinned at her and practically bounded toward her, taking her into his arms. How are you feeling, my Ava Jane? Good, she said, and that was true. She met Justin's eye over his father's shoulder and cleared her throat. Matt stepped back and turned to stand beside her. He took her hand and grinned with all the power he possessed at his son. Justin, this is Ava Jane Proctor. AJ, my son, Justin. He had dark hair like his father, and brooding eyes when he wasn't laughing. He didn't have a beard at all, and he stood a couple of inches shorter than Matt. The shape of his nose came from someone else, as did the way his chin went to a point instead of a square like Matt's. Hello, she said, putting a smile on her face. She stepped away from Matt to shake Justin's hand. I'm glad your flight wasn't canceled this time. His arrival had been postponed a few days, and while it had added to AJ's worries, she'd actually been glad about it. Yeah, Justin said, glancing at his father. He didn't say anything else, and that only lit AJ's anxiety on fire. She, too, looked at Matt, whose smile hadn't slipped an iota. How was the flight? She asked next, wishing she didn't have to dig so deep into her small-talk reservoir so soon. You came from Baltimore, right? The city, Matt said quietly, at the same time Justin said, No, that's Lisa. She's coming from Baltimore. I thought she was going to Baltimore, AJ said, frowning. Why was everything so jumbled in her head? Since she'd been put on bed rest, she felt like she'd lost track of her life. She barely knew what day it was, and the hours slipped by like smoke disappearing into the sky. She'd gone back to the doctor, and she'd been cleared for anything that didn't require lifting over 10 pounds. She'd taken to walking in the morning, first going north toward the ferry station, and then sticking to the shoreline boardwalk all the way to the lighthouse. Kristen would join her there, and the two of them would complete the circuit back to AJ's house. In all, it put 2 miles on her step counter for the day, and AJ felt like a new person after the exercise. She'd spent so much of her life working out or being active, and the past month had been terrible for her physically and mentally. Since she'd been getting out in the sunshine, her outlook on life had improved greatly. Last week, she'd found and written 3 articles, and she'd finally started to bring in some money again. She had enough in savings to go for several months, especially since she'd been doing freelance since the beginning of the year. Matt didn't ask her to pay for anything. And while they hadn't had a specific conversation about money, AJ didn't want to lounge on the couch, rewatching the same movies over and over while he went to work each day. She'd never wanted that life, and she thought that had definitely contributed to her aversion to marriage in her 20s. Now, at 44, AJ's life very nearly mirrored those of other women's her age. "Lisa lives in Baltimore now, yes," Matt said. "She's going back there too, baby, for grad school." "Oh, okay," AJ said, focusing on Justin again. He reached up and wiped his hand through his hair. "How was the flight from JFK? I lived in New York City for a little bit last year." "Yeah," Justin said again. "That's what Dad said. You lived there before he got you pregnant." AJ pulled in a breath, and Matt said, "Justin, come on." He released AJ's hand and started down the hall. "I'll show you where your room is." Justin bent to pick up his carry-on, and he grabbed the other piece of luggage Matt had left by the door. He glared at AJ as he went by, silent. She turned and watched them go, hearing Matt say something to his son that wasn't loud enough to reach her ears. "And he's the most forgiving one," she muttered. This was going to be harder than she thought. Her chest stung, because while she hadn't anticipated his children to throw a welcome AJ party for her, she hadn't expected the glaring. Nor had she thought that he would act like her pregnancy was a mistake, something a 16-year-old boy would do because he didn't know better. As if Matt and AJ didn't know how to not get pregnant. Like their baby was unwanted, but they were dealing with it the best way they knew how by getting married. She couldn't get a proper breath, and she turned and went through the kitchen and out the back door. Matt had a beautiful deck that overlooked a pristine backyard. He grew roses and dwarf Granny Smith apples. He spent the weekends trimming the hedges into perfect 90-degree angles. While spring still only showed her face for a few hours each day, Matt had been spending a lot of time in the yard. For one, their reception would take place right here, on the lawn and deck in front of her. For another, he spent so much time on the grounds at the golf course, which his father owned, that he thought his yard should look just as pristine. AJ wasn't complaining, though she'd rarely lived in a home that required her to take care of the lawn. Growing up, she'd done plenty of weed pulling and lawn mowing, but she didn't particularly enjoy it. She'd lived in apartment buildings and condos for most of her life since leaving the Cove, and not having to do the yard work was only one of the perks of such a life. Something scraped. And AJ looked left as someone opened the window in the bedroom where Justin would be staying. When Derek came, he'd be in there with him. Matt and AJ shared the master, obviously, and Lisa would be in the third bedroom. The house had a dedicated office space, which Matt and AJ shared, and the formal living room, besides the family room, kitchen, and dining room. The 3 of them would have to share a bathroom, but Matt had assured AJ they could. They'd done it before. "Really fast, don't you think?" Justin's voice came through the now open window. "You should hear Mom rant about it." "I'm not married to your mother anymore," Matt said. his voice full of bite. Which, by the way, Justin, she wanted, not me. She cheated on me. If you say so,
Justin said, his voice moving farther from the window. AJ's heart pounded really hard because she hadn't known Matt's ex-wife. She hadn't known she'd been unfaithful. She hadn't really asked him what had happened in his marriage to end it. Matt had told her he wasn't happy, and that he hadn't been for years. He and Melanie had talked of divorce previously, but they'd waited until their youngest left the house. His divorce had been final in August, and AJ had run into him a month later. She hadn't caused his marriage to end. She hadn't caused him to be unfaithful.
I do say so,
Matt said,
because that's the truth. Just because she hasn't married Theo yet doesn't mean they weren't together a year before we got divorced. A year, Justin.
AJ couldn't hear what his son said as she walked toward the edge of the deck and down the back steps. She didn't want to overhear them. She didn't want to know what Matt hadn't told her himself. So his kids weren't happy about the baby or the wedding. They'd all agreed to come, probably out of loyalty and love for Matt. Their mother was obviously talking trash behind Matt's back, and AJ wondered what he'd do about that. Nothing, she murmured to the marigolds. Matt wouldn't do anything about Melanie's forked tongue. He wouldn't call her and reprimand her. He hadn't even said anything to Justin about his behavior toward AJ. She bent down and touched the bright yellow blooms, knowing that wasn't true. He had said something to Justin. That was why they were arguing in the bedroom. AJ thought about the dinner she'd prepared, bubbling away in the slow cooker. She didn't have all the skills Robin or Kelli did in the kitchen, but even she could put in a beef roast with potatoes and carrots. She and Matt hadn't starved yet, at least. She'd gotten the recipe for the onion soup the roast boiled in from her sister, and AJ tugged her phone from her back pocket and texted Amy. He's not happy to be here. I don't know how to do this. One moment at a time, Amy said back. It'll just be an adjustment for everyone. Be patient. Be patient, AJ repeated, and she had the distinct feeling she needed to give herself time to figure out how to deal with Matt's children, and they needed time to realize how much happier Matt was now that he wasn't with Melanie. He'd admitted that he hadn't seen himself returning to the Cove to run the golf course, but his father had called the very day he'd been served the divorce papers. He'd come straight away, and they'd both admitted they could stay and live in the Cove. They could raise their child here the way they were raised here. Matt had already joked that if the baby was a girl, he was putting locks on her bedroom window, and he'd check them every evening. AJ had laughed with him, because he used to sneak in through her window at night to be with her. In all honesty, AJ was lucky she hadn't gotten pregnant in high school, though she had known about and used contraceptives back then. She hadn't with Matt several months ago, believing herself too old to get pregnant.
AJ?
Matt said, and she lifted her gaze from the flowers. He hadn't seen her yet, and she did adore the boyish way about him. He'd had that as a teen, too, and there had always been this innocence about him that touched her heart. His kindness had been the real trigger for her, then and now, and she never felt like he was judging her. Right here, she said, lifting her hand. He found her and strode across the deck.
Justin wants to go to dinner.
That's fine.
No, it's not fine.
He wore frustration on his face. He came down the steps heavily.
Sorry about that in there. I talked to him on the way over from the airport, and he didn't give any indication that he wasn't thrilled to meet you.
He's probably just trying to process it all, she said, smiling at him. Fragility shook her heart, and her lips felt like they might crack any second.
He said it's because you're prettier than Melanie. He said it triggered him for some reason.
Matt reached for her.
I'm sorry. I was caught off guard. I told him he can't treat you like that, or say rude things about the pregnancy, or he can't stay here.
I don't want to come between you and your son. Any of your kids.
Not, he said. I told him you had dinner ready and we don't need to go out. I'm fine if he wants to go out to eat. It was a pot roast, not a gourmet meal she'd spent more than 20 minutes putting together. At least not physically. I finished my article and sent it to Zephora. She said I'd hear back by Monday morning. She reached up and put her hand on the side of Matt's face, enjoying the softness in his beard. Besides, the baby and I are feeling like lobster rolls. Matt grinned at her, those dark eyes filling with love and a hint of heat that made AJ's whole world expand. Well, the baby gets whatever she wants, right? Right, she said. He does. They laughed quietly together, as neither of them knew the sex of their child, and AJ didn't want to find out until the doctor handed the infant to her and said, "It's a boy." She really only wanted a boy, a fact she had not hidden from Matt. Just to goad her, he'd said he wanted a girl. That way, he'd have 2 boys and 2 girls, making a complete set. In all honesty, AJ didn't care if the baby was a boy or a girl, though she thought she was nothing but trouble and a boy would be easier. Matt put his arm around her and guided her back to the steps. So, Mort's? Mort's on Saturday night? AJ shook her head. We better call now and just pick up. We can take it to the beach and watch the sun go down. Sounds good, Justin said ahead of them, and AJ lifted her eyes to meet his. She painted a smile onto her face, sure he didn't really think her prettier than his mother. He simply needed more time to accept the divorce and AJ's new role in his dad's life. She could be kind to him, and she could be patient until he had time to process the situation. Sometimes AJ thought she was still processing how much her life had changed in only a year, and she'd appreciated how kind and patient her friends had been with her. Great, she said, approaching the 19-year-old. If you load up a couple of beach chairs, we can relax while we eat the best seafood in the cove.
Chapter 11. Alice reached for the triangle of garlic toast on Arthur's plate. I'm just saying... She trailed off, not quite sure how to say what she was trying to.
Is it because I work at the high school?
Yes, she said. And then she sighed. No, sort of. She took a bite of the toast, wondering how restaurants got such a crispy outside on the bread. She loved the thick slab of it, and the way it crunched between her teeth. She moaned, I love this stuff. Arthur smiled at her, but it didn't last long on his face.
I think the twins will survive.
I'm sure they'll survive, she said. It's not that I'm worried about. It's the fact that I want them to keep talking to me about sensitive things. I want them to want to come home after they leave to go to college. I want them to trust me. And if I just go off and marry you, I'm afraid that will put all of that in jeopardy. Arthur started to nod about halfway through her speech. I'm not saying they're more important than you, but...
They are,
Arthur said.
I know that. It's okay with me.
Alice heard the false note in his voice, and she hated that she couldn't erase it. You're important to me in a different way than they are. That's all. She finished the toast and dusted her hands of the crumbs. We've only been dating for a few weeks. You do realize couples talk about marriage when they're in love? She gave him a small smile, but really her heartbeat skipped through her chest in a quick rhythm. She'd managed to put off the conversation for a week, citing her need to get through the wedding, and then a busy week with an online conference before she'd even be willing to entertain the idea of talking to him about saying I do. She saw him almost every day, and she enjoyed her time with him. She liked kissing him, and she liked texting with him. Her children knew about their relationship, but Alice had a feeling she'd be dealing with a coup if she told Ginny and Charlie that she was thinking about marrying Arthur. They'd probably be horrified if they knew she was sleeping with him already. Even for Alice, their relationship had accelerated quickly. She'd been celibate for so long, even inside her own marriage. She'd tried one other relationship before Arthur, and while there had been a spark between her and Will, it had been an old flame and easily quenched. With Arthur, an entire lightning storm struck her cells every time she even thought about the man. He reminded her so much of the first month of her relationship with Frank, and she couldn't put another bite of her salad in her mouth, despite the delicious crab, avocado, and lemon dressing. "I need more time," she said, meeting his eye. She reached over and cradled his face in one hand. "I do adore you, Arthur. I don't want to end things with you at all. I like where we are, and I want to keep doing what we do." She swallowed and picked up her fork as if she would take another bite of the lettuce, tomato, and fish that made such a medley in her mouth. "Are you happy with that?"
Very much so,
he said. He turned his face into her hand and kissed her palm before taking her fingers in his.
I've simply learned to claim what I want early so it doesn't get away from me.
Maybe you wouldn't feel the need to do that if you tried to enjoy the time we have now.
I do enjoy the time we have now.
You worry too much about the future, she said, giving him a knowing glance and pulling her hand back. She speared a square of avocado and a single craisin to go with her lettuce. "Tell me I'm wrong."
You're not wrong,
he said with a sigh.
It's just, I feel like I've been waiting for a woman like you for a very long time, and I'm tired of being alone.
He lifted his shoulders into a shrug.
That's all.
Yes, but that doesn't mean we have to get married in the next 30 days. She smiled at him softly, hoping this conversation wasn't coming across as a rejection. She didn't want to end things with him. She wanted to keep getting to know him and keep finding out if they were as compatible as they first seemed.
How is everything?
Their waiter appeared, and Alice looked up at him. "So great," she said.
Are you going to need boxes? Dessert?
"I definitely want dessert," she said. And since she and Arthur had frequented the yacht cafe several times, she knew exactly what she wanted. "I'll take that warm pumpkin spice cake."
With ice cream?
he asked. "Is there a better way to eat cake?" She grinned at the waiter, who chuckled and looked at Arthur.
Anything for you, sir? I just want another glass of wine, please,
he said.
Coming up.
The 20-something knocked on the table and walked away, and Alice watched him go. When she turned back to Arthur, she took another bite of salad while he finished his lobster ravioli. "I think I should sit down with the twins and be honest with them about what our relationship is." That brought his gaze up.
Oh?
"Who knows?" she said slyly. "Things could shift between us at any moment, and I'll be ready to marry you sooner than I even know." Arthur blinked at her, and Alice trilled out a laugh. "Don't look so surprised."
You just said you needed more time.
"I do," Alice said, shaking her head. "Time to talk to the twins. Time to see how they feel. Time to know how I feel. I'm less than a year out from my divorce, Arthur. I'm not like you at all, but that doesn't mean I won't get to where you are in a few months. Who knows?" Even now, her heart did a little tap dance at the thought of facing Ginny and Charlie and telling them she was sleeping with their school counselor. A man she'd met because he'd called her in to talk about Charlie's chemistry performance. "Maybe this is a bad idea," she said. "I basically tell Charlie every chance I get not to do anything with his girlfriend." She put her bite of salad in her mouth, but it tasted too bitter now.
It's not even the same situation at all,
Arthur said.
For one, we're not juniors in high school.
"But he is, which is why I have to talk to him every single day about being careful with girls." Alice sighed. "I fear he has too much of his father in him."
I think you'd be surprised,
Arthur said.
He knows who his father is, Alice.
He spoke in a quiet voice and leaned back in the booth.
He knows what his father has done and what it cost him. You've tried to shelter your kids from that, and you've done a fabulous job of it. But they know.
Alice didn't want to believe him. But deep down, she did. She wanted her kids to think only good things about Frank, and she wanted them to believe in love. Real love. True love. I know they know, she admitted, but I want them to believe in love. The kind of love Robin and Duke have. The kind of love I saw on Eloise's face and shining from Aaron's eyes. The kind of love every young person should hope for, that their spouse will be forgiving and kind when they make mistakes, and that they'll have this future filled with rainbows and happy endings. She sighed, really needing her pumpkin spice cake. She glanced around for the waiter, but he wasn't anywhere in sight.
That's beautiful, Alice,
Arthur said, reaching across the table to hold her hand.
Do you believe in that kind of love?
I did once, she said, ducking her head.
But not anymore?
His fingers around hers tightened. She looked up at him, searching his beautiful eyes. That's one of the things I need time to find again, she said. Because if I'm ever going to stand at an altar again, it's going to be with a man who adores me, who I adore. And the two of us together can make sunshine and rainbows appear no matter what the weather is around us. It'll be the true love I've always wanted in my life. Arthur smiled fondly at her.
Sounds like a dream come true.
Do you believe in love like that? She asked. Have you had that in your life?
No, ma'am, I have not,
He said.
but I'd like it.
He pulled his hand away as the waiter arrived with her cake and Arthur's drink. He lifted the glass of wine to toast her, and the edge in his eyes told Alice that he'd like more time with her to find out if they could have this true love they spoke of. So, more time, she said, dipping her spoon into the ice cream and looking at Arthur.
Definitely more time,
He confirmed for her. Okay, Alice yelled over the noise a few days later. Tacos are here. That got the teenagers in her living room to turn in her direction and acknowledge that she'd spoken. She made every one of them stop at the front door and tell her their name before she allowed them into her house, so they had to acknowledge her then, too. After that, they did their best to pretend she didn't even exist. Now that Alice and the twins lived on Diamond Island, Charlie and Ginny's friends had shifted a little bit. Charlie said he still talked to the friends he'd had on Rocky Ridge, but Alice didn't have to entertain them in her house. This crew he hung with now definitely came from a different side of the tracks than the boy who'd brought pot to the pool party last summer. Charlie's new girlfriend, Soraya Page, was a straight-A student and the president of the academic Olympiad. Charlie had never been the smartest student in school, but he tried hard. He worked when he was motivated, and a pretty blonde girl sure was motivating. Alice wasn't complaining about that, but she wanted Charlie to be liked for who he was, not what his report card showed. "Thanks so much, Mrs. Kelton," a girl named Emily said. She was Ginny's best friend, and she actually did talk to Alice like a normal person. "You're welcome," she said. And that prompted several others to express their gratitude for the tacos and quesadillas Alice had ordered from the fast food Mexican joint that sat on the beach, only a mile away from her house. Food share had saved her more times than she could admit, and on a Sunday evening before a Monday where her kids didn't have school due to a senior college and job fair the next day was the best example. She could feed the 8 bottomless stomachs in her house with a taco dozen by the box for less than $20.
Do we have any soda pop, Mom?
Charlie asked, finally coming into the kitchen with Soraya and a boy named Tad, who he'd been spending a lot of time with this year. They'd met in Charlie's shop class, and they had history and Spanish together, too, which had honestly been an answer to Alice's prayers. She worried about moving her children all over the place. And while the islands in Five Island Cove was all the same town, it was still somewhat hard to hang out with others living on the other islands. She knew, as she'd grown up on the northernmost island of Rocky Ridge, and her only choices for some evenings was to ride the ferry back to Diamond to spend time with Robin, or riding her bike around the end of the island to Audrey's, a girl who'd never really liked Alice. They tolerated each other because they were in the same year in school and had to ride the ferry together in the mornings. After Alice's mother had died, though, Alice did what she wanted, and it wasn't to spend any time with Audrey. She didn't come home until late at night, and she'd seen firsthand some of Robin's mother's crueler statements. Still, Jennifer Golden's house had been better than Alice's. Now, she wanted her children to be able to bring their friends over whenever they wanted. She wanted her house to be safe for anyone who walked through the door, and if that cost her $20 in tacos on Sunday night, she'd do it.
"Thank you, Mrs. Kelton,"
a boy named Ray said, and he smiled at her. He had nice eyes, sort of a light color between blue and green, with plenty of dark hair that curled everywhere. "Of course," she said, smiling back. He reached for a taco and held it up.
"Before we all go back into the living room, I have to say something." "Taco toast!"
someone yelled, and Alice knew enough to get out of the way. She'd been through a taco toast before, and sometimes lettuce and tomatoes went flying. She'd also witnessed a pizza pledge, and that was slightly less messy, depending on the toppings on the pie. "Shh," someone said, and finally enough people had quieted for Ray to lift another taco in the air.
"I'll never eat another taco again if Ginny doesn't go to the prom with me." "This is not happening,"
a girl said. Alice whipped her attention around the group, trying to find her daughter. She knew exactly who Ray was, and Ginny spoke highly of him. Alice hadn't asked her daughter if she liked Ray for more than a friend, but the moment she located Ginny's flaming red face, she had her answer. "Is that an invitation to the prom?" Ginny asked, her eyes shooting lasers at the boy holding the dual tacos. "The prom that's in literally 2 weeks?" Alice started to step forward and then fell back again. She'd do what she could to help Ginny get a pretty dress for the dance.
"That's the one,"
Ray said, still grinning.
"I just found out I'm not going to my dad's, or I would have asked you earlier."
He started to lower the tacos. Ginny ducked her head, and Emily and Abby, another of her friends, created a little huddle, the three of them whispering like mad.
"She's gonna say yes," Charlie said. "Don't worry, man."
Ray had the tacos all the way down by the time Ginny's huddle broke up. She folded her arms and said, "Okay, but Ray, you owe me more than a taco toast."
"Like what?"
someone asked, and it sure sounded suggestive to Alice. Her pulse beat a little faster while she waited for Ginny to answer. Emily stepped forward and said, "She wants ice cream every day after school this week."
"She works at an ice cream shop,"
Charlie said, frowning. "Exactly," Emily said, grinning. "So she'll be expecting you to stop by and get something, then fill out the survey so she gets bonus points with her boss."
"Done,"
Ray said, laughing.
"Now come on, I've held these tacos hostage for long enough."
He'd actually done no such thing, though he was popular enough that everyone had paused in their taco consumption for his toast. The chatter broke out again, and Alice folded her arms while Ginny giggled with her friends. Then she came rushing toward Alice, her face definitely flushed. "Mom, can we go shopping tomorrow, please?" Alice didn't say yes or no right away. She'd expected the twins to sleep late and then eat cold cereal for brunch while something played on the TV. She'd work until mid-afternoon, and then they'd go see a movie or go to the beach. She supposed dress shopping could replace that afternoon activity. "I have to work," she said. "Arthur is coming for dinner." Even as she said it, she wondered if she should cancel. She wasn't going to disclose the true status of their relationship yet, but he'd suggested he could spend more time with the twins, and Alice had thought that was a good idea. "And there will be a budget," Alice said, "unless you want to call your father." "I have $200 in my account," Ginny said, grinning. "Thanks, Mom." She threw her arms around Alice and held her. He's so cute. I can't believe he asked me to prom. So we like this boy. Ginny nodded as if her neck had become rubber. Okay, Alice said. We can go tomorrow. Ginny squealed and said, thanks, before she grabbed the remaining tacos in the dozen box and took them into the living room, where almost everyone had regathered. Alice noticed that Ray had saved her a seat next to him, and that he put his arm around her and squeezed her tight before they kept eating tacos. Chapter 12. Laurel stood on the dock, her hands in her police department jacket as the wind blew in her face. Fishing boats dotted the water in front of her, and on any other day, with any other woman, it might have looked like an idyllic, near-summer day. Blue sky, puffy white clouds, salty breeze, colorful sails with a beach to her right where families gathered for picnics and days in the sand, surf, and sun. She could see herself on that beach, with Paul in a pair of multicolored board shorts and trotting toward her with a boogie board under one arm. He'd grin at her and collapse onto a towel in the sand beside her. Robin would pass out sandwiches, and Alice would spring for sodas, and everything would be perfectly, completely normal. Normal, Laurel said, wishing she could be normal. She hadn't been operating in the realm of normal for many long years. Just when she started to think she might be edging closer and closer toward a suburban life with a husband and children, a nice house with a green patch of lawn surrounding it, something came up that pulled her away from it. The growl of a vehicle met her ears, and she turned away from the picture-perfect scene in front of her. Drugs found their way even into the most pristine of places, including Five Island Cove. They could be getting onto the island via boat, a commuter boat, a private vessel, or a fishing boat. She'd put that piece into place at Eloise's wedding last weekend, when she'd seen the boats floating benignly in the water. That, coupled with Duke right there at Robin's side, had triggered Laurel's mind. There was only one airport coming in and out of Five Island Cove, and that happened right here on Diamond Island. But there were multiple docks on every other island. The drugs could be coming in shipments to public places like hotels, restaurants, or the golf course. Laurel had spent every waking moment she wasn't with Paul or her new partner reading about the unique and diverse ways people moved illegal things. Money launderers used actual laundromats to move money. Strip clubs, hotel chains, anything that they could hide the money moving in and out behind real transactions. Drugs could be no different. They could arrive in a package of new towels for an inn, or sewn inside the fish of the day on a boat selling to the most popular restaurant in the cove. She didn't know which way to turn, and she hadn't been able to talk to anyone about the circular thoughts in her head. As she watched the man she loved, Paul Leahy, get out of the rideshare, she knew she needed to trust him. She needed to trust him enough to tell him about her case, ask for his opinion, and then listen when he spoke. Paul was a brilliant cop, the second in command at the department. He could help her, but only if she opened the door and let him in. She put a smile on her face as he turned away from the car. A grin popped onto his face, too, and he jogged the last few steps to her. Laughing, he swept her off her feet. "Look at us," he said, gazing up at her. "We finally have the same day off." He set her back on her feet and leaned down to kiss her. Laurel did enjoy the intimacy that came with kissing. She almost liked kissing more than anything else, though she did like being with Paul. He treated her with love and respect, and she could lay in his arms and listen to him breathe for hours. She'd rather sleep in the same bed as him than alone, and he said she could move in with him anytime she wanted. She hadn't done it yet, mostly because she didn't want to explain anything to her mother. She also wasn't sure she wanted to live in his house and give up hers. She loved her house beyond measure, because it had been the very first thing she'd acquired on her path toward freedom. Paul possessed more patience than anyone she knew because he'd told her to keep the house if she wanted to. In truth, Laurel was still figuring out what she wanted. Today, she wanted to walk the beach with Paul's hand in hers, eat lunch, and talk to him about her case. She focused on the light touch of Paul's hands in her hair and down her back. Her mind slowed as she kissed him back, and she finally felt centered enough to get things to line up. Paul pulled away but kept his face close to hers.
I know we talk every day, but I've missed you nonetheless.
I've missed you too, she said. I feel distant from you.
That's because you're on narcotics now.
He stepped away, his eyes sticking to hers for a moment. She couldn't deny what he'd said, so she just turned back to face the wind, and he joined her. I want to talk about my case today, she said. Would that be okay? I can't riddle through it alone anymore, and I trust you to tell me what I'm assuming that I shouldn't be.
All right,
he said.
How are things working out with Tom?
Good, Laurel said truthfully. Yeah, good. Tom's good. He's nice and he's smart. He works more than the chief.
Paul chuckled and said, I highly doubt that.
Just feels like it, Laurel said. Narcotics is a lot different than being in a car.
Yes, it is,
Paul said.
Going crazy behind the desk?
Yes, a little, she said. It's not my strong suit. I like being out there. She waved her hand toward the horizon in front of her. Doing things. He grinned at her and slid his arm around her waist.
I know, sweetheart.
He took a deep breath and blew it out.
Today is gorgeous, isn't it?
Yes, Laurel said. Feels like summer already, though my mother says it's still cold in Nantucket.
In May?
Paul asked.
I suppose it rains a lot in the spring. With the wind, it could be cold. Laurel drew in a breath that wasn't cold here in Five Island Cove and blew it out.
We're trying to track down where the drug entry point is, she said. We've got a witness who turned over the air traffic control books, and we've got 2 people in custody, but... She let out a sigh.
But what?
Paul asked. Their story is too perfect, she said. It's orchestrated and well-rehearsed. It's not right.
You think the drugs are coming in another way?
I feel it in my gut, Laurel said.
You always have to listen to your gut.
So I've been exploring all the ways things are moved, and it's everything from planes, boats, regular citizens mailing things to each other, to businesses, and just anywhere. They could be coming in through the multiple docks on any island here. Someone could be shipping them via commercial boat or plane to hotels, restaurants, and the like. Tom and I are going out to Rocky Ridge this week to find out what's going on with the golf course there.
The golf course?
Yeah, because it's right on the water. They have a floating green even. It wouldn't be hard to have someone motor by in a boat and hand someone a package. Drug deals don't take place in back alleys anymore. They're everywhere, and they originate online.
Okay, true,
Paul said. He paused for a moment as a mother came jogging toward them, her stroller in front of her. She took up the whole sidewalk, and Paul stepped out of the way so she could get past. He grinned and nodded at her, but the interruption actually annoyed Laurel.
So what's the problem?
He asked, once the jogging mother had passed. Laurel's mind had gone with her, because she wondered if that could ever be her. Do you want kids? She asked Paul, who looked at her with shock in his dark blue eyes. She hooked her thumbs over her shoulder. Yeah, kids. Like, if I had a baby, I could run with him in a stroller along the beach in the morning. Paul blinked, and Laurel had never surprised him before. She smiled at him and gave him a playful push. Did I surprise you?
A little, he said, grinning. I didn't think you wanted children.
I think I could have kids, she said. With you. He ducked his head in an adorable way. She'd seen the alpha male side of him at work, but she sure did love the softer side of him that came out on their dates.
I'd love to be the father of your kids,
he said.
Laurel took another breath, and things shifted for her again. In the grand scheme of things, her first narcotics case was just that, a case for work. She didn't have to dedicate her entire life to it. She wanted room for Paul, too, and she wanted room for her friends. I think I'm so confused about the case, she said slowly, because it touches every part of my life. How do you mean? Paul strolled along beside her, and Laurel recognized how comfortable she was with him. The weight of her thoughts descended on her again. For example, let's say I start visiting the hotels and inns in the Cove. Who would I have to go to? I'd start with the bigger places, but then I'd be looking at hot spots that are a little bit out of the way. Places where it would be easy to get packages or guests that no one in the Cove would ever see. The Cliffside Inn. Laurel knew Paul would get it. She didn't even have to keep explaining, but she went on anyway. Matt Hymas owns the golf course on Rocky Ridge. I'm already going there this week, and I don't know how to tell AJ. I don't even know if I should tell AJ. If we start looking at government officials or cops that are pilfering on the side, that brings in Kelli's boyfriend and the chief. Her mind spun now. If I start investigating fishing vessels, we're talking about Robin and Duke. Waterfront properties brings in the lighthouse and Kristen. It could literally touch all of my friends, and I can't hurt them. I won't. She ran her hand through her hair, feeling her panic start to rise. But it's my job. If they're bringing drugs into Five Island Cove, they should be stopped. Laurel, honey, stop and think for a second. Paul stepped in front of her and made her physically stop. Do you really think the chief is the one bringing in drugs? Of course not, she whispered. I don't think so either, he said, nor do I think Cliffside is getting shipments of cocaine with their soaps and shower gels. Laurel shook her head, near tears now. I don't either, but I don't know how to turn a blind eye to all those places just because they're my friends. That's not what detectives do. You have to investigate the case and turn over every stone. She thought about the money Kelli had found only a month ago, along with the list of names her father had written on a paper with it. AJ's name had been listed, and Laurel had seen Aaron Sherman dive into the case without any prejudices at all. She'd also seen AJ retreat from the group, and she'd seen the way it had splintered through the other women. In the end, of course, AJ wasn't involved with Kelli's father, but the words had already been said. The accusations made. AJ hadn't left the Cove or shut everyone out, but Laurel could still feel that things weren't the same. If she started making accusations left and right, or even asking questions about Duke's fishing boat or Kelli's boyfriend and what he really did for the town of Five Island Cove, she'd be setting bridges on fire. So you're going to the golf course, he said. See what turns up, look through the controller's notes again, do some interviews of your guys in custody. What does Tom say? Tom says the guys we have in custody are covering up for someone bigger. Laurel sighed again. I agree with him, but I'm not sure who that is. Anyone big. Paul, it's Aaron or Aaron's father. I mean, think about it. Not true, Paul said, and he sounded like she had when she'd argued with Tom about this. There could be any number of people connected to this that would be a big deal. Do you know how the drugs are getting to the users? Harold said he was dropping it in the library night book return. What? Paul asked, looking at her with shock again. Have you interviewed all the librarians? There are 3, Laurel said, frowning. And no, I personally haven't. Tom said he and Kent followed up that lead, and they learned nothing. The library? Paul asked again. Laurel, there has to be something there. How many people have a key to the library? There are cameras at the library, closed circuit. If he was dropping the drugs there at night, how many people could really get in and retrieve those? Laurel nodded. You're right. I can't just accept Tom's word that the lead didn't pan out. I need to talk to the librarians. Find out who has access to the library at night. It is connected to the courthouse as well as the traffic school, and they run those on Thursday nights. Did he make drops only on Thursdays? Laurel's mind spun in a new direction now. Harold didn't specify, she said slowly. I'll be sure to ask him. She needed to figure out where the closed-circuit tapes were stored, and she could get the footage of the evenings surrounding the dates Harold and Lucas said drugs had been flown into the cove. Okay, she said, exhaling. Enough about work, unless you have something? Nothing for me, he said, sliding his arm around her again. Do you really mean enough about work? Yep, she said. We're going to enjoy lunch, and Robin gave me a whole list of things I want to ask you about for the wedding. Then she can start putting together our dream event. Paul groaned, but he laughed in the next moment. But you just said we didn't have to work today. Planning the wedding is not work, Laurel said, hipping him away from her. It's easy stuff, Paul, like what kind of cake you want and the colors for the dresses and flowers. Mm-hmm, he said with a touch of sarcasm. Aren't we wearing uniforms? You said you'd wear that sexy policewoman's skirt. His hand on her hip tightened, and Laurel warmed from head to toe. I will, she said, but I have to carry flowers down the aisle, Paul. We need centerpieces, decorations. The colors are for those. Ah, I see. Do you? She asked. We should probably get our engagement pictures done too, because we're not having a long engagement. I guess selfies don't count, he said. No, she said, smiling into the wind now. Selfies don't count. She managed to push her worries about her case to the back of her mind, but they didn't go away completely. She finally got to enjoy herself with her fiancé by telling herself she'd go over all of the notes on the case once she got home later that night. Chapter 13. Kelli walked up the hill toward the house on Seabreeze Shore, the sight of it glowing in the sun making her heart fill with wonder and joy. She couldn't believe she owned this house, and she couldn't believe her dreams of opening her own yoga studio lay only 6 weeks in the future. That thought sobered her slightly, and she arrived at the house a few minutes later, panting and out of breath. Better than yesterday, she told herself. She'd been riding the ferry with Parker from Pearl to Belle, where he continued on to Diamond with another mom and her son. Kelli got off and made the short 10-minute walk around the corner and up the hill from the ferry station to the wellness center she was implementing into this house. She'd only been doing so for about 10 days, and every day the walk got easier and easier. She found a half-dozen packages on the porch, which also had become the norm. She'd been ordering everything from towels for the aerobics classes to plastic cups for the juice bar to scented lotions for the bathrooms. The front door sat slightly ajar, and Kelli nudged it open with her foot to hear a couple of guys talking inside. Her construction foreman appeared a moment later, wearing his sunglasses inside the house as the light streamed through the stained glass windows. Morning, he said, smiling at her. I wasn't sure where you wanted those. I'm not either, Kelli said, entering the house with 2 boxes stacked on top of one another. She took them to the right, into the room where she'd found the money that funded this project, and put them on the table there. The furniture in this room would eventually be cleared out, but for now, Kelli was using the space as an office of sorts. Cal brought in the biggest box with a groan, and Kelli went to get the last few. Thanks, she said, pushing her bangs back out of her face. Cutting them had been a big mistake, and she honestly had no idea what she'd been thinking. She felt so different this week than even last week. Parker would be leaving for the summer soon. Another school year would end. She'd quit her job at the junior high. She'd been able to attend the Wednesday luncheon last week, but it hadn't been the same without Eloise there. She returned home from her honeymoon tomorrow morning, and she'd be at the luncheon a few hours later. You want to come look at the changes upstairs? Cal asked. Kelli gave him a smile, because he and Ian had been here every day for the past week. Sure, she said. The pipes were okay, you said? Yes, he said, heading for the stairs. He took them two at a time all the way to the top, but Kelli had just climbed that hill. She'd been doing her aerobics routine in the afternoons, and her stamina would be back where it needed to be before she had to start teaching classes. Right now, though, she took the steps one at a time like a normal person. The scent of coffee reached her nose, and she perked up as Ian came out of her old bedroom with the to-go cup in his hand. I brought this for you, Miss Kelli, he said. You're a lifesaver. She took the coffee and inhaled the rich aroma of it before taking a sip. How's it going in there? Her old bedroom was going to be a massage room. They needed water in the room, though, and that had required some plumbing from the bathroom that sat across the hall. Good, Ian said. Come check out the vanity. He stepped back into the room and Kelli followed him. The glorious light poured in the front of the house, and Kelli closed her eyes against the brightness and warmth. It would be such a shame to put heavy blackout curtains over that window, and once again, her mind flashed to making this space a place to do pedicures instead. Maybe it could be both, she thought. Massage tables could fold up and be put away. She turned toward the wall where her bed had been, and she could easily put 3 pedicure stations there. The windows took up the wall in front of her, and then to her right, the wall there could hold a television. Her masseuse could play soothing music over the device, or they could put on daytime TV for women getting their nails done. The massage table could go right inside the closet when they weren't using it, and the vanity would be used for nails and massages. It looks great, she said, her eyes finally landing on the 4-foot addition to the bedroom. She stepped over to the single sink, the cabinets below it a shocking white, and the countertop a deep contrast in dark brown. She could still see through the floor, and the boards they'd pulled up to run the pipes had been stacked in the closet. They'd put all of that back together, though, and Kelli could bring everything together with rugs, drapes, and linens. She knew the softer pieces of her room actually made it possess a certain feel, and everything she'd been looking at for her wellness studio came in shades of peach, gray, and blue. She wanted soothing, comfortable, tranquil. A running water fountain in this room would be fantastic, and Kelli could see it in the front corner, the droplets all lit up by the sunshine. She met Cal's eye as he came through the door and into the bedroom. Remember how I said I might want to do pedicures in here? A wary look entered his eye, but Kelli forged forward. How hard would that be to plumb? It's a good thing I'm married, he said, giving her a smile. He stepped between her and Ian and pointed at the floor. My wife has changed her mind a zillion times on things around our house, so I figured since you mentioned it, I'd go ahead and have Linus put in the pipes you need to fill the basins. On this wall? Kelli asked, her vision shifting. She looked past him to the far wall. I know what you're thinking, he said. It's an outside wall, ma'am, and it would cost you thousands to run the pipes over there. They're already here, as they go down to the bathroom below this and into the kitchen. Remember, it's like veins spreading out. You can't get too far from the source. Right, she said, turning in a full circle as her view for the room changed. I could still do 2 chairs over here. Yep, Cal said. If there's something you don't need water for, you can do that on the other side. She nodded and gave him a smile. Thanks, Cal. This is amazing. We'll have this room back together today, he said, glancing at Ian. The new cabinets for the kitchen are coming this afternoon, and we'll get started on installing those, too. New fixtures for the bathroom downstairs by the end of the week, Ian said. Then we're on to cosmetic repairs and touches, Cal said. We'll be out of your hair in less than 2 weeks. Kelli couldn't believe how quickly they worked. The remodel and repurposing of the house would only take 3 weeks, and she reminded herself it was just the updating of 2 bathrooms and a kitchen, as well as this new plumbing into this room. They weren't tearing walls down and ripping out everything to the floorboards. Come see the new partition in the master, Cal said, and Kelli's heartbeat bumped strangely. She had to stop thinking about the large, long room that took up the entire western half of the upstairs as her parents' bedroom. The room had a big picture window on the north side of it, as well as one that faced west. Since it was such a large room, and Kelli had two of those downstairs, she wanted this one to be sectioned off slightly. She followed the two men down the hall and past the steps. In the meeting room, as she was calling it, she found the partition exactly as she'd pictured it. Oh, wow. The light from the north windows came around the side of the wall as well as over it, as Cal hadn't connected it to the ceiling. It really is just a partition. You weren't sure you'd like it, he said with a knowing smile. So we preserved the great height in the room that the vaulted ceilings give by not taking it all the way to the ceiling. The light you want is still there, from both windows. He moved toward the bathroom. We restained the wood in here to make it more modern, and the 3-day bathroom fitters took care of the shower and tub. New toilet is waiting for install, and that's it. Kelli had forgotten she was updating this bathroom too. She still had some sort of mental block about this room she needed to figure out. She took a quick look in the bathroom, nodded, and then faced the rest of the space. She envisioned this as a great space for women to meet. She could have nutritionists and dietitians come do classes here, clothing classes for how to wear the right type of clothes for a specific body type, anything really, though she didn't particularly want to do aerobics or yoga up here, unless her schedule became so full she couldn't meet the needs of the people coming to the wellness center. Around the partition, that space would host her office. She'd wanted a space specifically for that, so she wouldn't take her work home with her, and she crossed the meeting space to the office area. Joy filled her at the quaint space with all that natural light. She had enough room for a desk and chair, a filing cabinet, and a lamp. That was all she needed, and she turned back to Cal and Ian, who both wore questioning expressions. Kelli had a hard time controlling her emotions, and she nodded as she grinned from ear to ear. It's perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. She went toward the tall, burly construction men and hugged them both, only worrying afterward if such a thing was appropriate. They'd murmured words of, "You're welcome," and "of course," and they all started downstairs. We'll be in and out, Cal said. I'm going to unbox and put things away, Kelli said. Then I have interviews, but I can do those on the porch if I have to. We won't be in your rooms downstairs, he said, just back and forth. She acknowledged that she'd heard him, and then she went toward the table holding all the boxes they'd brought in that morning. She removed fluffy Turkish towels the color of driven snow, a case of antibacterial wipes, and the new front doorknob from one box. Look what came, she said to Ian as he entered the house with his toolbox. Can you put this on today? The new doorknob came with an electronic code. That way, anyone could get into the center if they had the code. No keys required. Kelli was planning to run an early morning yoga class that started 10 minutes after the first ferry arrived on Belle Island. She wouldn't run that one, but the one later in the morning after school started. Right after that class, she'd do an aerobics class, and then the juice bar would open. She honestly had no idea how many people would come all the way to Belle for yoga, aerobics, or wheatgrass, but she'd been working on the website and her social media for the past week too. Eloise had promised to help her with the software needed for booking classes and clients, and even as a tremor of fear ran through Kelli, a stronger one of excitement overshadowed it. Sure thing, Ian said, taking the doorknob. These are easy. Just the one? Kelli turned back to the boxes. I actually ordered 2, one for each door. Let me see if the other one is in another one of these boxes. She dove back into the boxes and found the second doorknob nestled among several boxes of teas. She worked steadily, finding new homes for all of the things she ordered. Her phone rang near lunchtime, if the grumbling in her stomach was to be believed, and she swiped on the call from Shad. Hey, how's it going over there today? He asked. Kelli sank into her office chair and faced the windows that overlooked the front yard. So amazing. She sighed at the gently waving leaves on the trees. You'll have to stop by and see the progress. The bathrooms look great, and the new partition is fantastic. She continued to tell him about the pedicure idea, and then she asked, How did your meeting go this morning? His sigh wasn't nearly as blissful as hers, and Kelli immediately started to brainstorm ideas to cheer him up. Shad loved to eat, and Kelli always went to Diamond in the afternoons to pick up Parker from school. It was a doozy, he said, so much so that I left work early. You did? She got to her feet and started toward the front door. Something in her gut told her she'd find her boyfriend coming up the street toward the house on Seabreeze Shore. A smile filled her whole soul. You're on Val, aren't you? Not quite, he said, chuckling, but almost, wondering if you could play hooky this afternoon. Why? She asked, her pulse trembling as she stepped onto the porch. What did you have in mind? Me and you, he said quietly, because he probably stood nearby other people. Lunch at the Kaleidoscope Cafe, a walk on the beach, maybe a little gardening before you have to go back to Diamond. Gardening? Kelli giggled. You're talking about going back to your place after lunch. Kaleidoscope will be busy at noon. I've called ahead, he said. Ah, so you're planning on me saying yes? Hoping, Shad said. Kelli had the distinct thought he was hoping for a lot that day. Lunch, a romantic walk on the beach, and then taking her back to his place for some gardening. Her lungs forgot they were supposed to inhale, and her head turned fuzzy. She hadn't been with a man in a long time, and certainly not someone she wasn't married to. Her voice seemed to take a vacation as she reverted to the woman she'd been last year when she'd first come to the Cove for Joel Shields' funeral. Behind her, a door slammed, and Kelli jolted out of that scared skin. That woman who thought about her husband before herself in every instance. I can play hooky this afternoon, she said, but I think we should talk about a few things before we do any gardening. Can't wait, Shad said, the smile in his voice obvious. Should I get a ride share and come get you, or do you want to meet me at the ferry station? How far out are you? 10 minutes? He said. I'll meet you, Kelli said. Give me 20 minutes and I'll be there. The call ended, and Kelli hustled back inside to figure out where she'd left things. She gathered her purse and her wits and called goodbye to Cal and Ian. The walk back to the ferry station always went faster because most of it was downhill. She just reached the corner when she caught sight of a woman walking toward her, a little Yorkie on a leash at her side. Mom, Kelli called, and her mother looked up from the ground. They smiled at one another, and instead of turning to walk the half-block to the ferry station, Kelli crossed the street to hug her mother. I was just coming to the house, her mom said, grinning as she stepped out of the embrace. I have big news. Kelly's smile tipped a little, but she managed to keep it in place. Devin proposed. Her mom's smile couldn't be contained, and her next words rushed out of her. He proposed, and I said yes, and we're going to get married right here on Belle Island. Kelli wasn't surprised by this news, and she laughed as she drew her mom into another hug. I'm so happy for you, Mom, she said. He's so great, and you deserve to be happy. She pulled away and held her mom by her shoulders. Have you told Heather and Sabrina? Not yet, she said. I was coming to talk to you first. When's the big day? That's what I wanted to talk to you about, her mom said. I want all you girls to come. I want the whole family to come. Sabrina is busier than everyone else, and she probably won't be able to come in the summertime. Worry entered her mother's expression. I was thinking the holidays, Thanksgiving or Christmas. Would that be terrible? Kelli frowned, trying to find a reason why that would be terrible. I don't see why, she said. It It would be a good time for them to come, I would think. Celebrate the holiday together, then have the wedding. Right. Do you want me to text them? Kelli asked, glancing toward the ferry station as the big boat blew its horn to signal its arrival. Shad's meeting me for lunch. I won't keep you then, her mom said. And yes, if you could text them to find out what they think, that would be great. Kelli nodded, her attention divided. Her mom turned and went back the way she'd been coming, as she lived on the West Beach on Belle Island. Kelli walked toward the ferry station, her mind brewing over why she had to be the one to tell Heather and Sabrina about their mother's engagement. There had to be more going on in those relationships than she knew, but she wasn't sure what. She knew her own relationship with her mother had been stilted and stalled for a long time, and neither Heather nor Sabrina had been back in the Cove for longer than Kelli had. She did know she didn't want to get in the middle of family drama. But she did want both of her sisters to come home and see how different things were. As she caught sight of Shad, who burst into laughter when he saw her, she realized that the Cove wasn't different. She was. She'd changed. Just kissing Shad in public told the world that. Sorry your meeting was hard, she whispered as people flowed around them in the ferry terminal. It's fine, he said. Now, what has you glowing? Can't all be from the plumbing in the center. My mom is engaged, Kelli said, some of her earlier excitement returning. A natural worrier, she knew the anxiety over talking to her sisters and trying to get them to come to the Cove for the wedding would return soon enough. Right now, though, she just wanted to enjoy the afternoon alone with her handsome boyfriend. Engaged, Shad said, giving her a sexy smile filled with insinuations. That's an interesting idea.